Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into one of history's most miserable experiences, the medieval siege camp. Picture this. You're standing at the edge of a sprawling military encampment that stretches as far as your exhausted eyes can see. Thousands of tents sag under perpetual drizzle. Smoke from countless cook fires mingles with something far worse, the unmistakable stench of human waste. Rotting food, and unwashed bodies packed together like sardines in a very unfortunate tin. You probably think you'd tough it out because you've been camping before, maybe survived a music festival without showering. Trust me, you wouldn't last until lunch. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. I love seeing this community spread across the globe. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You've just arrived with your lord's army to lay siege to a fortified town. The year is 1347, and you're somewhere in what will eventually be called France. Though right now it's just a patchwork of territories constantly at war. The castle you're besieging sits on a hill about half a mile away. Its stone walls thick and imposing, pennants snapping in the wind like the fortress is taunting you. Your job, along with roughly 10,000 other poor souls, is to sit here and wait until the people inside either surrender or starve. Sounds simple enough, right? Just wait them out. Except siege warfare is the military equivalent of watching paint dry. If the paint could occasionally shoot arrows at you and the waiting happened in what amounts to a medieval sewage treatment facility. You trudge through the camp's entrance, though entrance is generous. It's really just where the mud starts to get particularly churned up by wagon wheels and boots. A guard barely glances at you. He's missing 3 fingers on his left hand, probably from a previous campaign, and he's picking at his teeth with a stick that might have been used for something else earlier. Welcome to your new home for the foreseeable future. The first thing that assaults you is the smell, and I need you to really understand this because it's not like anything you've experienced. Modern you has encountered trash day in summer. Sure. Maybe you've walked past a dumpster behind a restaurant. This is different. This is 10,000 men who haven't bathed in months, who are relieving themselves in open pits just downwind of where they sleep. This is horses and oxen contributing their own special bouquet to the atmosphere. This is food rotting in the heat because refrigeration won't be invented for another 500 years. This meat going off, vegetables turning to slime, and the sweet, sickly smell of disease that hangs in the air like fog. You try breathing through your mouth, but then you can taste it. There's no winning here. You press forward because turning back isn't an option. Desertion in medieval armies is punishable by death, and not a quick death either. They get creative with traitors. So you commit to your fate and start looking for wherever you're supposed to report. The camp sprawls in a rough semicircle around the besieged town, divided into sections based on which lord or knight the soldiers serve under. There's no unified command structure really. This is more like a medieval HOA where everyone has their own rules and nobody agrees on anything. The English section is over there. The Gascon mercenaries have claimed that bit near the Treline, and various French nobles have staked out their territories like dogs marking their spots. Everywhere you look, you see soldiers in various states of decay. Not literal decay, but the kind of exhaustion that comes from living in terrible conditions with no end in sight. A group of men huddle around a fire that's producing more smoke than heat, roasting something on a stick that you sincerely hope was once a rabbit. Their clothes are stained with mud and worse, patched and repatched until the original fabric is just a memory. One man scratches at his scalp with such vigor that you absolutely know, he's got lice. Spoiler alert. By tomorrow. So will you? You pass a blacksmith setup where a sweating man hammers away at arrowheads. The ringing of metal on metal cutting through the general din of camp noise. Next to him, a Fletcher sits cross-legged, attaching feathers to arrow shafts with the kind of practiced efficiency that comes from making thousands of these things. These are the skilled workers of the siege camp, the ones who keep the war machine running. They at least have a purpose, a trade. You, however, are just a regular soldier, which means you're basically medieval manual labor with a weapon you barely know how to use. The cart rolls past, its wheels squelching through the mud with each revolution. The driver is whistling something cheerful, which seems wildly inappropriate given that the cart is full of what you really hope is just dirty laundry and not bodies. You don't look too closely. That's lesson 1 of siege camp life. Don't look too closely at anything unless you absolutely have to. Curiosity doesn't kill the cat here, dysentery does. But curiosity certainly makes you more aware of all the ways dysentery might get you. You spot what looks like an officer's got slightly better clothes and an air of authority, which in medieval terms means he can read and hasn't died yet. You approach and ask where you're supposed to set up. He looks you up and down with the enthusiasm of someone inspecting a piece of furniture they're pretty sure is infested with termites. You're with the 5th contingent, he says, gesturing vaguely toward the eastern section of camp. Find a spot, don't cause trouble, and report for work detail at dawn. Work detail. That sounds ominous, and trust me, it is. You make your way through the maze of tents, shelters, and lean-tos that make up the residential area of this nightmare. The organization is chaotic at best. Some soldiers have actual tents, small affairs made of canvas or leather that at least provide some protection from the elements. Others have constructed rough shelters from branches and cloth, creating structures that look like they'd collapse if you sneezed near them. And some poor souls are just sleeping in the open, curled up next to fires, hoping the rain holds off. It won't. Historians still argue whether medieval siege camps followed any standardized layout or if each one was just organized chaos. Some evidence suggests that experienced commanders tried to implement Roman-style castrametation, that's the fancy word for laying out a military camp with designated areas for different functions. But most sieges were such prolonged, evolving affairs that any initial organization quickly degraded into whatever worked. The camp you're in has been here for 3 weeks already, and it shows. What might have started as orderly rows has become an organic mess of human habitation, growing and shifting like a living thing. You find an empty-ish spot near a group of soldiers who eye you with the suspicion medieval people reserved for literally anyone they didn't grow up with. One of them, a gap-toothed man with a face like a kicked-in shed, asks where you're from. You name your village, and he spits into the fire. Never heard of it, he announces, as if your hometown's obscurity is a personal failing. Welcome to Camp Social Dynamic Severiones, suspicious of everyone else, united only in their shared misery and the knowledge that the people inside the castle are probably eating better than they are. Night is falling, and you realize you don't actually have shelter yet. You don't have a tent because tents cost money and you're not exactly wealthy. You've got a blanket that's seen better centuries and a cloak that's more whole than fabric. One of the other soldiers, taking pity on you or perhaps just bored enough to engage, tells you there's some spare canvas near the supply wagons if you're quick. You hurry over, navigating by firelight because street lamps won't be invented for a good long while, and find a piece of material that could generously be called canvas. It's got a questionable stain on one corner and smells like it was previously used to wrap something that died, but beggars can't be choosers. You return to your spot and attempt to fashion some kind of shelter. The other soldiers watch with the kind of amusement people get from watching someone else struggle with IKEA furniture. If IKEA furniture could give you hypothermia when you assembled it wrong. You drape the canvas over a low branch and weigh down the corners with rocks, creating something that's technically a shelter in the same way that a house of cards is technically architecture. It'll keep some of the rain off. Some. As you settle in for your first night, sitting on ground so damp it's more like sitting in ground, you realize that sleep is going to be challenging. The camp never really gets quiet. There's always someone coughing, someone arguing, someone groaning in pain or discomfort. Horses whinny in the distance. Guards call out to each other. And underlying everything is a constant low murmur of thousands of men living in close quarters. The white noise of medieval military life. You wrap yourself in your blanket and try to find a position that doesn't have a rock jabbing into your spine. The ground is cold and hard and slightly wet, and you're already regretting every decision that led you here. Maybe if you'd been born to a different family, in a different time, you could have avoided this. But you weren't, and feudal obligations mean that when your lord says we're going to war, you go to war. It's not like you can submit your 2 weeks' notice and find employment elsewhere. Around you, the camp settles into its nighttime rhythm. The fires burn lower. Conversations fade to murmurs. Somewhere in the darkness, someone is definitely crying, though they're trying to do it quietly. You understand the impulse. This isn't glorious warfare. This isn't knights in shining armor having honorable duels. This is waiting, and hunger, and cold, and the growing realization that most sieges last months. You've been here for 4 hours and you already want to go home. A rat scurries past your shelter, bold as brass, completely unafraid of humans because it knows it's thriving here. The siege camp is rat paradise, unlimited food scraps, plenty of hiding places, and enough warmth from the fires and sleeping bodies to keep comfortable. For every human in this camp, there are probably 3 rats. You'll get used to them eventually. You'll have to. You finally drift into an uncomfortable sleep, your dreams filled with the smell of smoke and waste, the sound of coughing and movement, and the knowledge that tomorrow you'll wake up and it'll all still be real. The siege has barely started, and you're already exhausted. Welcome to medieval warfare's less glorious combat, and more dying slowly of preventable diseases while sitting in mud. Sweet dreams. Word count 2088. The first drops of rain start falling around midnight, gentle at first, like the universe is easing you into the reality of your situation. Then it picks up, because of course it does. Water seeps through your makeshift canvas roof almost immediately, finding every gap and hole with the precision of a heat-seeking missile. Within minutes, you're damp. Within 10 minutes, you're soaked. Your blanket absorbs water like it's been training for this moment its entire existence, becoming a heavy, cold, wet mass that provides negative warmth. You sit up, realizing that sleep is now completely off the table. Around you, other soldiers are having similar revelations. Curses fill the air in several different languages and dialects. Someone's shelter collapses entirely with a sad flapping sound, and the resulting string of profanity is actually kind of impressive in its creativity. You'd applaud if your hands weren't currently wrapped around yourself in a desperate attempt to preserve body heat. The rain continues, steady and cold, transforming the camp into a swamp. The paths between shelters become rivers of mud. The fire pits hiss and steam, struggling to stay lit, and you realize something truly terrible. This is normal. This is just what life is like here. The veteran soldiers aren't even complaining that much anymore. TVE accepted this as their reality. One man actually continues sleeping, snoring away despite being partially submerged in a growing puddle. That's the kind of exhaustion you're working toward. You spend the rest of the night in a miserable half-awake state, too cold and wet to properly sleep, but too tired to do anything productive. Your mind wanders to the people inside the castle walls. They're probably dry right now. They probably have actual beds, or at least dry straw to sleep on. Sure, they're trapped and their food supplies are dwindling, but in this specific moment, at 3 in the morning during a rainstorm, they're winning. Dawn arrives not with triumphant sunshine, but with a gradual lightening of the gray, rainy sky. You can see more of the camp now, and honestly, you were better off in the dark. The place looks like a disaster zone. Shelters sag under the weight of water. Soldiers emerge from their sleeping spots looking like drowned rats, clothes plastered to their bodies, hair matted down, expressions universally miserable. Welcome to day one. A horn sounds Simone's idea of a wake-up call, though most people are already awake, having been kept up by the rain. This is the signal for work details to assemble. Remember that officer who told you to report at dawn? He meant it. You stumble toward the gathering point, your boots making obscene squelching sounds with each step. You've lost feeling in your toes, which is probably for the best given what they're walking through. The work detail assembly area is just a slightly less muddy patch of ground where a sergeant is organizing workers into groups. He's the kind of man who looks like he was born angry and has only gotten angrier with age. His face is weathered like old leather, and he's missing an ear, which gives him a lopsided appearance that would be comical if he wasn't currently deciding your fate for the day. You, he barks, pointing at you and a dozen other miserable souls. Trench digging. East side. Trench digging. That sounds like exactly the kind of backbreaking, dangerous work you were hoping to avoid. Spoiler alert, there is no good job assignment in a siege camp. They're all varying degrees of terrible, and you've just been handed one of the worst. You're given a shovel, actually more of a spade. Really, with a wooden handle that's cracked and a metal blade that's seen better decades. This is your primary tool for the next however many hours. You and your fellow unfortunates trudge toward the east side of the siege perimeter, which means you're heading closer to the castle walls. Closer to where the defenders can see you. Closer to where arrows can reach. The point of trench digging is to create protective earthworks that allow soldiers to approach the castle walls with some cover. It's a logical military strategy that involves spending hours moving dirt while people try to kill you. The trenches need to zigzag so that defenders can't shoot straight down them, and they need to be deep enough to protect a crouching man. That's a lot of digging, and you're already tired from not sleeping. You arrive at your designated spot and stare at the ground. It's mud. It's all mud. You're being asked to dig a trench in mud, which is like trying to dig a hole in pudding. You push your spade into the earth, and it sinks in with a wet sucking sound that's somehow both disgusting and demoralizing. You lift out a shovelful of mud and dump it to the side, where it immediately begins sliding back toward the hole. This is going to be a long day. The rain has stopped, at least, replaced by a gray, overcast sky that promises more rain later. Small mercies. You dig, and dig, and dig some more. Your shoulders start burning within the first hour. Your hands develop blisters within the second. The mud is everywhere under your nails, in your hair, coating your clothes until you're more mud than human. And every so often, you glance up at the castle walls and see defenders watching you, probably placing bets on which worker will give up first. Around mid-morning, you think, time is weird when you're this miserable. Someone brings around breakfast. And that's where the next chapter of your nightmare begins. But let's pause here on that thought. With you standing in a half-dug trench, covered in mud, blisters forming on your hands, and your empty stomach about to discover what medieval siege rations really mean. You've survived your first night in camp. You've made it to your first work detail. The siege has begun in earnest, and you're already counting the days until this ends. Unfortunately, you can't count that high. The shelter situation in a medieval siege camp makes modern homelessness look like a luxury resort, and I say that with full awareness of how harsh that comparison is. You've already experienced one miserable night under your pathetic canvas arrangement. But let me really break down what home means for the next several months of your life. Spoiler, it doesn't mean what you think it means, and the word privacy is about to be completely erased from your vocabulary. After your first brutal morning of trench digging, you return to your little patch of camp exhausted, filthy, and desperately hoping that someone has magically improved your living situation while you were gone. They haven't. Your canvas shelter looks exactly as sad as when you left it, sagging in the middle where rainwater collected, corners weighted down with rocks that have somehow shifted during the day, creating new gaps for wind and water to exploit. This is home now. Get comfortable. Actually, Dantayu can't. The first thing you need to understand about medieval siege camp accommodations is that there's a strict hierarchy, and you're at the absolute bottom of it. At the top, you've got the lords and commanders who brought this army together. They have actual pavilion tents, large, multi-room affairs made of quality canvas or even wool, with wooden frames and sometimes flooring. These tents are essentially portable houses, complete with furnishings dragged along in wagons. Inside, there are beds with actual mattresses, tables, chairs, maybe even a brazier for heat. These men are camping the way modern people go glamping, which is to say they're barely roughing it at all. One step down, you've got the knights and minor nobility. They typically have smaller but still respectable tents, maybe 6 or 8 feet across, tall enough to stand in. They'll have a bedroll at minimum, possibly a cot if they planned ahead. Their tents are weatherproof, or as weatherproof as medieval technology allows. They have space for their armor, their weapons, maybe a squire sleeping at the entrance. It's not comfortable by modern standards, but it's positively luxurious compared to what you're dealing with. Then there are the sergeants, experienced soldiers, specialists like blacksmiths and engineers, the middle management of medieval armies. They usually have modest tents, shared between 2 or 3 people, crowded but functional. They stay relatively dry, have enough room to store their possessions, and can actually sleep lying down without a rock jabbing into their kidneys. They're the working class of the camp, and honestly, they've got it pretty good all things considered. And then there's you, regular infantry, cannon fodder, except cannons haven't been invented yet, so you're more like arrow fodder. You and the thousands of other basic soldiers make up the bulk of the army, and the bulk of the army sleeps rough. Very rough. Your canvas sheet isn't a tent, it's barely a tarp. You can't stand under it. You can't even sit up completely straight under it. It's essentially a very optimistic rain shield that fails at its only job whenever wind gets involved, which is constantly. You share your sleeping area with about 5 other men, not by choice but by necessity. Warmth comes from body heat, and survival in medieval times often means swallowing your need for personal space and huddling together like penguins. The men you're bunking with are a varied bunch. There's the gap-toothed guy from last night who still hasn't told you his name, a young kid who can't be more than 15 and looks absolutely terrified, an older veteran with a persistent cough that sounds like his lungs are trying to escape, a scarred man who never speaks and might be mute or might just hate everyone, and a loud fellow from somewhere up north who won't stop talking about his wife back home. Personal space is measured in inches. You sleep shoulder to shoulder with these strangers, sharing the same damp blankets, breathing the same stale air, listening to each other's digestive systems work through questionable food. The kid has nightmares and wakes up crying most nights. The veteran's cough keeps everyone awake. The loud northerner snores like a wounded bear. The mute one sometimes sleep talks, which is ironic, muttering incomprehensible things in the darkness. And Gaptooth apparently has a bladder the size of a walnut, getting up to piss every few hours and waking everyone in the process. Historians still argue whether the close sleeping arrangements in siege camps actually helped prevent hypothermia deaths or just accelerated disease transmission. The answer is probably Bothuri slightly warmer but exponentially more likely to catch whatever plague is making the rounds. It's a trade-off, and not a good one, but it's the only one available. Medieval military logistics didn't account for individual comfort. You were expected to be hardy, to endure, to survive on minimal resources. If you died from exposure or disease, well, there were always more peasants to conscript. Your first full day back at camp after that miserable work detail involves trying to improve your shelter, because if you spend another night like the last one, you're not going to make it. You scavenge for better materials, which means wandering the camp looking for anything that might help. You find some additional branches that could serve as a better frame. Someone's abandoned shelter, they either died, deserted, or moved to a different section, yields a slightly less holy piece of canvas that you appropriate without guilt. Guilt is for people with weatherproof housing. You attempt to engineer a better structure, which is hilarious because you have zero construction experience and your tools consist of rocks and hope. You prop up the canvas higher using the branches, creating something that almost resembles a tent if you squint and have low standards. You dig a shallow trench around the perimeter to divert rainwater, a trick the veteran told you about between coughing fits. It's not much, but it's an improvement, and small victories are all you get out here. Inside your expanded shelter, you've got a sleeping area that's just the ground with some straw scattered on it. Where'd you get the straw? You stole it from near the horse lines when no one was looking. And yes, smells like horse. And yes, there's probably horse piss in it. But it's better than sleeping directly on mud. Your pillow is your bundled up cloak. Your blanket is that same damp woolen thing that never quite dries out. Your mattress is the earth itself, with all its rocks, roots, and inexplicable wet patches. Storage is a joke. You have a small sack for your possessions, which amounts to one spare shirt, also damp, a wooden bowl for eating, a horn cup for drinking, a knife that serves as your eating utensil and only weapon, and a few personal items from home that seemed important when you packed them and now just seem like extra weight to carry. Everything smells like mildew and smoke. Everything is slightly damp. Everything will stay that way for the duration of the siege. The young kid bunking with you asks if it gets better, if you eventually get used to it. The veteran laughs, which turns into another coughing fit. You don't get used to it, he finally says, wiping his mouth. You just forget what better feels like. That's the most honest thing you've heard since arriving. This isn't about adaptation, it's about your standards eroding until not currently drowning counts as a good day. Nighttime in the shared shelter is an assault on every sense. The smell is indescribable. 6 unwashed men in close quarters. Damp wool, smoke-saturated clothes, muddy boots, and the general funk of medieval hygiene, which is to say, no hygiene. You'll stop noticing it eventually, not because it improves, but because your nose gives up. Sound is constant. Snoring, coughing, muttering, the rustle of people shifting positions, the scratch of fingernails on skin as everyone deals with their new louse populations, and the patter of rain on canvas that becomes the soundtrack of your existence. Touch is worse. Everything is wet or damp or heading toward wet. Your blanket feels clammy. The ground beneath you is cold and hard despite the straw. When you shift position, you inevitably bump into the person next to you, and they grunt or push back, and it's all just a miserable game of trying to find a comfortable position that doesn't exist. Temperature regulation is impossibly either too cold or, on rare occasions when bodies are packed tight and everyone's asleep, slightly too warm, which causes sweating, which makes you cold again when the moisture evaporates. The shelter leaks. Of course it leaks. No matter how carefully you positioned your canvas, no matter how many branches you used for framing, water finds a way. It drips onto your face in the middle of the night. It pools in the low spots of your sleeping area. It turns your straw bedding into a soggy mess that begins decomposing beneath you. You learn to sleep in positions that avoid the worst of the drips, curled in shapes that would give a chiropractor nightmares, waking up with new aches in muscles you didn't know you had. One particularly awful discovery comes after about 3 days. Insects have moved in. Not just the lice that colonized your body on day 1, everyone has those, but a whole ecosystem of creepy crawlies that apparently find damp, dark, human-filled spaces absolutely delightful. Spiders, beetles, things you can't identify in the darkness that crawl across your skin while you're trying to sleep. The kid screams the first time something substantial scurries across his face. By week 2, he doesn't even flinch. That's not adaptation, that's the death of hope. The camp has been here for a month now, and some of the more permanent residents have upgraded their situations. You see shelters that have evolved into something resembling actual structures, frameworks of wood scavenged from nearby forests, walls of woven branches and mud, roofs that actually shed water effectively. These belong to the soldiers who arrived earliest, who've had time to build, who plan to be here for the long haul. Your group is newer, which means you're stuck with inferior accommodations unless you can somehow improve your situation. You and your sheltermates discuss building something better. The loud northerner is enthusiastic about it, describing an elaborate plan involving logs and clay and a proper roof. The veteran just coughs and points out that building anything substantial requires time you don't have, since you're on work details from dawn to dusk, and energy you definitely don't have, since the rations barely keep you alive, let alone fueled for construction projects. The mute one starts gathering sticks anyway, apparently deciding to try despite the odds. You admire his optimism even as you recognize its futility. Privacy doesn't exist. You change clothes on the rare occasions when you have dry clothes to change into in front of everyone. You scratch at uncomfortable places while others watch. You listen to your sheltermates relieve various bodily pressures and pretend you don't notice. Modesty is a luxury, and you have no luxuries. The young kid is especially mortified by all this, still clinging to civilian standards of propriety. Give him another week. There's a particularly grim aspect to the sleeping arrangements that nobody talks about but everyone experiences. You form bonds with these people not through friendship but through forced intimacy. You know the sound of each person's breathing, the rhythm of their sleep, the noises they make in discomfort or pain. You know who has nightmares, who talks in their sleep, who cries quietly when they think everyone's asleep. You don't necessarily like these people, how could you? When their snoring keeps you awake and their poor hygiene contributes to the general stench. But you're bound together by shared misery. It's not camaraderie exactly. It's more like being cellmates in a prison where the sentence is indefinite. The weather makes everything worse, because of course it does. When it's cold, you're all huddled together desperately trying to preserve heat, pressed so close you can feel each other's heartbeats, breathing each other's air. When it rains, which is often, the shelter becomes a barely functional umbrella, keeping you perhaps 30% drier than you'd be sleeping in the open. When wind picks up, the canvas flaps and strains against its moorings, threatening to tear loose entirely and leave you completely exposed. You spend windy nights holding down edges of canvas, taking turns keeping the shelter from collapsing, getting no real sleep. One night, a serious storm rolls through. Wind howls through the camp like a living thing, tearing at shelters, overturning anything not weighted down, sending loose equipment tumbling through the darkness. Your canvas shelter is grossly inadequate for these conditions. The wind gets underneath it, lifting the whole structure like a sail. All 6 of you scramble to hold it down, grabbing edges, throwing your bodies on top of it, cursing the weather and your circumstances and whoever decided sieges were a good military strategy. Around you, other shelters are failing. You hear canvas ripping, men shouting, the crash of collapsing frameworks. Someone's entire tent tears free and goes sailing through the air like a very depressed ghost. The rain comes sideways, driven by wind, finding every gap and opening. You're soaked within minutes. The straw beneath you becomes a swamp. The ground turns to soup. And you realize with perfect clarity that you're going to be wet for days after this, because nothing dries in siege camp conditions. Nothing ever fully dries. The storm passes eventually, leaving devastation in its wake. Morning reveals a camp that looks like it was attacked, which in a sense it was attacked by weather, by the basic hostile forces of nature. Your shelter survived. Barely, though it's now even more saggy and pathetic than before. Other soldiers weren't so lucky. You see people trying to salvage torn canvas, rebuild collapsed frames, retrieve possessions that blew away in the night. The young kid in your group is crying again, and nobody comforts him because what would you say? It gets better? It doesn't. At least you're alive? That's setting the bar pretty low. You spend the morning after the storm trying to dry out, which is impossible, and trying to warm up, which is nearly impossible. The fires struggle to light with wet wood. When they finally catch, they produce more smoke than heat, and you stand there breathing in smoke because it's slightly warmer than the alternative. Your clothes steam. Your blanket steams. You yourself seem to steam, like you're slowly evaporating. Maybe you are. Maybe that's how sieges end, everyone just evaporates away. The hierarchy of shelter becomes more apparent after the storm. The Lord's pavilions are wet but intact, their wooden frames having weathered the wind. The knight's tents are damaged but reparable. The middle ranks have problems but manageable ones. And the regular infantry? You're evaluating whether your shelter even qualifies as a shelter anymore or if it's just a wet cloth you're emotionally attached to at this point. Historians still argue whether medieval armies could have provided better accommodations for common soldiers, or if the logistics of moving and supplying armies made it impossible. The reality is probably that commanders didn't care that much. Dead soldiers from exposure were unfortunate but acceptable losses. You weren't valuable as individuals, you were valuable as numbers, as bodies to throw at problems. If you survived the campaign, great. If you died from sleeping in freezing wet conditions, well, there were always more peasants to recruit next season. You make it through another night, and another, each one a small victory of survival. Your shelter doesn't improve much, there's only so much you can do with inadequate materials and no time, but you learn tricks. You learn to position yourself to avoid the worst leaks. You learn which sleeping position causes the least back pain. You learn to fall asleep despite the cold, the wet, the discomfort, the snoring, because exhaustion eventually overrides everything else. Sleep deprivation becomes your normal state, a constant fog that makes everything feel slightly unreal. The mute man actually succeeds in building a slightly better framework for one section of the shelter, improving the overhead coverage by maybe 20%. It's not much, but out here, 20% matters. You silently thank him, and he nods, and that's as close to bonding as you get. The loud northerner finally stops talking about his wife quite so much, either because he's accepted he might not see her again or because he's too tired to maintain the monologue. The veteran's cough worsens, a deep rattling thing that sounds like death warming up. One morning you wake up and the kid is gone. Just gone. His spot in the shelter is empty, his few possessions missing. He deserted during the night, slipping away while everyone slept, choosing to risk execution rather than spend another day here. Nobody reports it. What would be the point? You all understand the impulse. The only thing stopping the rest of you is the knowledge that deserters usually don't make it home, theory caught, or killed by bandits, or die of exposure in the wilderness. At least here you have food, such as it is. Speaking of which, your stomach is growling with an intensity that suggests it's about to start digesting itself. Time to discover what medieval siege cuisine really means. And trust me, you're going to wish you hadn't. Your stomach has been making threatening noises for hours now, gurgling and cramping like it's preparing to file a formal complaint with management. You've been at this siege camp for almost a week, and the food situation has gone from not great to actively alarming with impressive speed. Remember how you thought military rations would at least keep you functional? Oh, you sweet, naive fool. Let me introduce you to medieval siege cuisine, where the main ingredient is regret and the special of the day is dysentery. The camp's meal schedule is theoretically twice daily, something resembling breakfast after dawn work assignments begin. and a more substantial meal in the evening when the day's labor ends. I say theoretically because timing is fluid, portions are inconsistent, and meal is a generous term for what you're actually receiving. You line up with hundreds of other soldiers at the distribution point, which is just a series of large cauldrons set over fires, tended by camp cooks who look exactly as miserable as you'd expect from people whose job is turning terrible ingredients into barely edible food. The line moves slowly because there are so many people and so few distribution points. You stand there, stomach cramping, mouth watering despite your brain knowing that whatever you're about to eat probably isn't worth the anticipation. The men around you are hollow-eyed and gaunt nobodies getting enough food here, and it shows. Weight loss is universal in siege camps. Some soldiers have been here since the beginning, nearly 2 months ago, and they look like scarecrows in stained clothes, their faces all sharp angles and sunken cheeks. You finally reach the front of the line. A cook with burns on his forearms and an expression of profound apathy ladles something into your wooden bowl. It's a grayish-brown mixture that might technically qualify as porridge if you're exceptionally generous with definitions. It's made from whatever grain they're currently distributing. Could be oats, could be barley, could be wheat that's seen better seasons. Honestly, it's hard to tell once it's been boiled into submission. There are lumps. Some lumps might be grain that didn't cook properly. Other lumps might be things you'd rather not identify. You also receive a piece of bread, and I'm using the term bread loosely here. It's a hard, dense chunk of something that was definitely baked at some point in its life, though whether that was recently or during the previous siege is up for debate. The bread is dark, not the appealing dark of fancy modern whole grain, but the suspicious dark of flour that included a lot more than just wheat. Medieval flour was often stretched with other ingredients: peas, beans, corns, and yes, sawdust when times got really desperate. Your bread probably contains all of the above. You take your bowl and your bread and find a spot to sit, which is just a relatively dry patch of ground. The porridge is lukewarm at best. It's been sitting in the cauldron for a while, and there's no system for keeping food hot. You dip your bread into the porridge to soften it, a necessary step unless you want to break your teeth on what's essentially an edible rock. As it softens, you notice things in the porridge. Small dark specks. Those are weevils, tiny insects that infest stored grain, and they're absolutely everywhere in medieval food supplies. You fish out the visible ones, but there are definitely more that you can't see or have already disintegrated into the general mixture. The taste is charitably bland. More accurately, it's unpleasant. The grain has a musty flavor that suggests it was stored in less than ideal conditions. There's a slight bitterness that might be from burned bits at the bottom of the cauldron or might be from whatever else got thrown in there. No salt. Salt is expensive and you're not important enough to waste it on. No butter, no honey, no anything that might make this palatable. You're eating grain paste, and you're grateful for it because it's calories and calories keep you alive. Halfway through choking down your breakfast, you notice something move in your porridge. A maggot, pale, wriggling little maggot, cheerfully swimming through your meal. You stare at it for a long moment, and this is how you know the siege has already broken something and you just eat around it. You don't have the energy to go get another serving. You don't have the luxury of being picky. Food is food, and protein is protein, even if that protein is technically a decomposer larva. The bread requires serious work. Even softened, it's dense and hard to chew, with a grainy texture that catches in your teeth. You notice darker spots in the bread mold. Not extensive mold, just little patches that someone decided weren't worth trimming off. Mold won't kill you, probably. It might make you sick, but everything here might make you sick, so you eat it anyway. Waste is unthinkable when you're this hungry. Your body is screaming for sustenance, and your brain has learned to stop asking questions about where that sustenance comes from. Historians still argue whether medieval armies could have maintained better food supplies during prolonged sieges, or if the logistics simply made it impossible. The reality is probably somewhere in between. Yes, it was logistically challenging to feed thousands of men for months, but also commanders often underestimated how long sieges would last and didn't plan accordingly. Your army expected to take the castle in weeks. It's been months. The supply chains are stretched thin. The food that arrives is already low quality, and it only gets worse as it sits in camp storage. Around you, other soldiers are having similar experiences with their meals. The gap-toothed man from your shelter is picking weevils out of his porridge with the resigned efficiency of someone who's done this many times before. The loud northerner is gnawing on his bread and complaining loudly, as is his nature, about how his wife's cooking is infinitely better. The veteran isn't eating at all, just coughing into his hand and staring at his bowl like it personally offended him. His appetite is gone, probably because whatever sickness is making him cough has also killed his desire for food. That's not a good sign. You finish your breakfast in grim silence, scraping the bowl clean because leaving food is stupid when you don't know when the next meal is coming. Your stomach feels fuller but not satisfied. There weren't enough calories in that porridge to truly fuel a day of hard labor. You're running on a deficit, burning more energy than you're consuming, which is why everyone in camp is losing weight. Slow starvation is the baseline condition here. Just enough food to keep you functional but not enough to keep you healthy. The evening meal is theoretically better, which is like saying a kick to the shin is better than a kick to the groin. Technically true, but not particularly comforting. You line up again as the sun sets, your body aching from another day of brutal work. Today you were on supply hauling duty, carrying sacks of grain and barrels off liquids of various descriptions from the supply wagons to the distribution points. Your shoulders are screaming. Your back feels like someone inserted hot pokers into your spine, and your hunger is a living thing that's threatening to eat you from the inside out. The evening cauldrons contain something that might be stew if you're feeling optimistic. There's a liquid component, probably water with some meat fat if you're lucky, and chunks of things floating in it. You recognize some turnips, which is great because turnips are food, even if they're the most boring food in the medieval vegetable hierarchy. There are also chunks of meat, and this is where things get interesting in the worst possible way. Medieval siege camp meat is, to put it mildly, questionable. The army has herds of animals that travel with it: cattle, pigs, sheep, providing a moving food source. But keeping animals alive and healthy in the same conditions that are destroying the humans is challenging. Animals die of disease. They die of injury. They die of poor conditions. And when an animal dies, wasting the meat would be criminal. So into the stew pot it goes regardless of exactly why or when it died. The meat in your bowl could be from an animal slaughtered yesterday or an animal that died of mysterious causes 3 days ago. You literally cannot tell. You fish out a chunk of meat and examine it. It's gray-brown, a color that doesn't appear in any modern meat packaging because it would trigger immediate health inspections. It's tough, requiring serious chewing, and it has a flavor that's more animal than any specific type of animal. Could be mutton, could be beef, could be horse. Horses die frequently in military campaigns, and their meat, while not preferred, is edible. Could be rat. Honestly, there are enough rats in camp that you wouldn't be surprised if some entrepreneurial soul was trapping them and selling them to the cooks as mystery meat. The stew also contains your daily bread ration, another rock-hard chunk that you break apart and drop into the liquid to soften. This evening's bread has visible mold on one edge, green and fuzzy. Definitely not supposed to be there. You tear off the moldy section and throw it away. You've developed standards. Small amounts of mold get eaten, but visible fungal colonies get discarded. This is what passes for food safety in your new life. As you eat, a soldier near you suddenly doubles over and vomits spectacularly, his dinner making an immediate reappearance. Nobody reacts much. Food poisoning is common enough that it barely registers anymore. The man wipes his mouth, looks at his now empty bowl with profound sadness, and shuffles away. He'll be back in line tomorrow, hoping his stomach tolerates the next batch better. There's no sick leave in a siege camp. You either work or you die, and sometimes you do both. The camp's water situation deserves its own nightmare category. There's a stream running near the camp. One of the reasons this location was chosen, but thousands of men and animals using the same water source means it's contaminated beyond belief. The smart soldiers know to only drink water that's been boiled, which means the tea that gets distributed with meals. It's not really tea in any meaningful sense. It's hot water with maybe some herbs thrown in to disguise the taste, but at least it's been heated enough to kill some of the parasites and bacteria. You drink your portion of hot water tea, which tastes like mud with aspirations of being something better. It's the color of weak coffee, but without any of coffee's benefits. No caffeine, no flavor, just hot liquid to keep you hydrated. Dehydration is a serious problem in the camp despite the abundance of water, because drinking untreated stream water is basically playing Russian roulette with your intestines. You see soldiers drinking straight from the stream anyway, either out of ignorance or desperation, and you mark them mentally as people who'll be dead within the week from dysentery. Some enterprising soldiers have figured out how to supplement their rations through foraging and trading. The forests around the camp, before they were stripped bare for firewood and construction materials, provided some edible plants. Mushrooms, berries, nuts, all the things that hunter-gatherers survived on. Of course, identifying edible versus poisonous mushrooms requires knowledge that most soldiers don't have, leading to occasional incidents where someone eats the wrong fungus and spends their last hours in spectacular gastrointestinal distress. Natural selection in action. Trading is a whole economy unto itself. Soldiers with any possessions to spare trade them for extra food. A decent knife might get you a week's worth of additional bread rations. A nice cloak could be worth several meals. Some men gamble their rations at dice games, betting their dinner on the chance to win someone else's. You see a soldier who lost badly sitting beside a fire, watching others eat, his own stomach empty because he threw terrible dice. That's a special kind of stupid, but desperation makes people stupid. There's also theft. Naturally, when you're hungry enough, morality becomes flexible. Food goes missing from supply wagons. Rations disappear from beside sleeping soldiers. You learn to keep your bowl with you at all times and to eat your food immediately upon receiving it, because leaving it unattended for even a moment means it'll vanish. The camp has unofficial thieves who specialize in food stealing, quick hands that can snatch bread from your spot while you're distracted. Getting caught stealing food is a serious offense. Punishments range from beatings to execution, depending on the commander's mood, but hunger is a powerful motivator. Your body is adapting to the reduced caloric intake in ways that aren't pleasant. You're constantly cold now because you don't have enough body fat for insulation. Your thinking feels slower, muzzy, like your brain is running on low battery mode. Your wounds and bruises from work details heal slowly, if at all, because your body doesn't have the resources for proper healing. You're tired all the time, a bone-deep exhaustion that sleep doesn't fix because you're not getting enough fuel to recharge. The psychological impact of constant hunger is insidious. You think about food constantly. During work details, you fantasize about meals from home, your mother's stew, fresh bread with butter, roasted meat, anything that isn't gray mystery porridge or moldy bread. These thoughts are simultaneously comforting and torturous. You dream about food. You wake up from dreams of feasting to the reality of an empty stomach and another day of inadequate rations. It breaks something in you, slowly, meal by insufficient meal. Some soldiers try to be optimistic. They talk about the feast they'll have when the siege ends, when the castle falls and they can loot the storerooms inside. Castles under siege are supposedly full of preserved food, smoked meats, wheels of cheese, barrels of wine, sacks of good grain. The fantasy sustains them. Just hold out a little longer, and there will be food. Real food. Enough food. You try to believe it, but you've also heard that besieged garrisons usually consume their supplies as they wait. Meaning by the time the castle falls, there's often nothing left worth taking. There's a pecking order even in food distribution. The lords and knights eat better. They brought their own supplies, have money to purchase from traveling merchants who show up occasionally, and receive larger portions from the communal stores. You see servants carrying platters to the command tents, actual cooked dishes that smell like real food. The disconnect is maddening. You're all technically on the same side, besieging the same castle, but the aristocrats dine while you choke down weevil porridge. One evening, a rumor circulates that the supply wagon from the nearest town has been delayed. Maybe it hit trouble on the road. Maybe bandits attacked it. Maybe it just broke a wheel and won't arrive for days. The news spreads through the camp like wildfire, and you see the fear in everyone's eyes. The rations are already inadequate. If the supply wagon doesn't come, they'll be reduced further. You might go from 2 meals a day to 1. You might get even smaller portions. The margin between barely surviving and actively starving is thinner than you thought. The supply wagon does eventually arrive, 3 days late, and the collective relief is palpable. But the food it brings is even worse than usual. The grain is moldier. The dried meat is more suspicious. The bread is harder. It's like the supply chain is deteriorating as the siege drags on, each delivery bringing progressively worse provisions. You eat it anyway because the alternative is not eating, and not eating means death. Your digestive system is a constant source of misery. The low-quality food and contaminated water mean you're basically always dealing with some level of gastrointestinal distress. Stomach cramps are normal. Diarrhea is expected. You've learned to identify the difference between regular discomfort and something is seriously wrong discomfort, and you're not at the serious stage yet, but you're heading there. The veteran in your shelter has crossed that line. He's not eating much anymore, and what he does eat doesn't seem to stay down. He's getting thinner, his face more skeletal, and everyone can see he's dying, but nobody says it out loud. The psychological warfare of hunger affects everyone differently. Some men become aggressive, quick to anger, ready to fight over perceived slights or minor food disputes. Others become withdrawn, quiet, conserving energy by minimizing interaction. The loud northerner has stopped talking as much, his monologues about home replaced by sullen silence. Gaptooth has developed a habit of staring at his empty bowl for long minutes after finishing, as if willing more food to appear. You've been at the siege for 2 weeks now, and you've lost weight you didn't have to lose. Your clothes fit differently, loose where they used to be snug. You can feel your ribs more prominently. Your face looks gaunt when you catch your reflection in puddles, sunken cheeks, prominent cheekbones, the look of someone being slowly consumed by circumstances. And the siege has barely started. The castle could hold out for months more. The question isn't whether you'll survive the siegites, whether you'll survive the survival. You've been putting off thinking about this, but your bladder is making it impossible to ignore any longer. After choking down your evening meal of questionable stew and moldy bread, nature is calling with increasing urgency. Time to discover one of the most genuinely horrifying aspects of medieval siege camp life: the latrines. And when I say latrines, I'm being extremely generous with the term, because what you're about to experience makes modern porta-potties look like luxury bathrooms at a 5-star hotel. The camp sanitation facilities, and I use that phrase with maximum sarcasm, are located downwind of the main encampment. At least someone had the sense to put them downwind, though downwind is a relative concept when you're living in a sprawling military camp with no real organization. You follow your nose, which is unfortunately the most reliable navigation method, because the smell hits you long before you see the actual facilities. It's a thick, physical presence in the air, a stench so profound that it feels like it's coating your lungs with every breath. You round a cluster of tents and there they are, the latrines of doom. They're essentially long trenches dug into the earth, maybe 4 feet deep, 3 feet wide, and stretching for about 20 yards. Wooden poles have been positioned across the trenches at intervals, giving users something to squat over. That's it. That's the entire setup. No walls, no privacy screens, no roof, just open trenches filled with human waste, with poles to perch on while you contribute to the collective horror. The trenches are supposed to be moved, periodically filled in, and new ones dug elsewhere, but that requires labor and organization that the camp barely maintains. These particular trenches have been here for weeks, and it shows. They're nearly full, a churning mass of waste that's taken on a life of its own. The surface bubbles occasionally as decomposition gases escape. The color is a uniform brown-black that your brain refuses to process as something that came from human bodies. Flies swarm in clouds so thick they create an audible buzz. This is hell's bathroom, and you desperately need to use it. There's no queue system because that would require order in chaos. Soldiers just find an open spot on the poles and do their business. Privacy is non-existent. You're doing this in full view of everyone else who's also here, plus anyone walking past, plus probably some defenders on the castle walls who figured out where the latrines are and occasionally shoot arrows at the most vulnerable targets for entertainment. Nothing says medieval warfare like the risk of being killed while taking a shit. You find a spot on one of the poles and begin the precarious process of squatting. The pole is slippery. I'll let you imagine why, and your balance is immediately tested. You're trying to position yourself so that you're over the trench while also not falling into the trench, which would be an instant death sentence, not from the fall but from the infection and disease you'd contract from being submerged in that nightmare soup. Men have died this way. It's not a joke. Falling into the latrine pit is a real hazard that claims lives during every prolonged siege. The squatting position is uncomfortable and unstable. Your thighs burn within seconds. Your knees crack. You're acutely aware that one slip, one moment of lost balance, and you're going in. Around you, other soldiers are in various stages of the same miserable process. Some look seasoned, able to maintain their position with minimal effort. Others, like you, are clearly struggling. One poor soul a few poles down loses his balance slightly, windmills his arms dramatically, and barely catches himself. The near miss sends a wave of sympathetic fear through everyone watching. The smell at this distance is beyond description. It's not just the sharp ammonia stink of urine or the earthy smell of feces decay. This rot, this disease, it's every bad smell you've ever encountered combined and amplified by the sheer volume of waste. Your eyes water. Your gag reflex triggers repeatedly. You're trying to breathe through your mouth, but that just means you're tasting it, which is somehow worse. There's no winning strategy here. You do your business as quickly as possible, which is difficult because stress and discomfort make everything harder. Other soldiers chat casually while squatting, having adapted to this situation in ways you haven't yet. They discuss work assignments, complain about officers, share camp gossip, all while perched over a pit of biological horror. The human capacity for adaptation is remarkable and occasionally disturbing. Wiping is its own adventure. There's no toilet paper, obviously, because that won't be invented for centuries. The standard medieval solution is whatever you can find. Leaves if you're lucky enough to find clean ones, grass if it's available, or most commonly your hand, followed by wiping your hand on the ground or on some grass, or just accepting that your hand is contaminated now and moving on with your life. Some soldiers have torn strips from their clothing to use as rags, washing them in the stream afterward, which is great for their personal hygiene but terrible for everyone downstream who's drinking from that stream. You finish and carefully extract yourself from the squatting position, your legs trembling from the sustained effort. You've made it without falling in. which counts as a victory. You look around for somewhere to clean your hands and realize the answer is nowhere effective. There's no hand-washing station, no soap, no clean water. Some soldiers are rinsing their hands in a bucket of water that's been sitting here for who knows how long, but that water is probably more contaminated than their hands were to start with. You opt to just wipe your hands on some grass and accept that you're going to be spreading bacteria to everything you touch until the next time it rains and you can maybe get actually clean. Historians still argue whether medieval armies understood the connection between poor sanitation and disease, or if they just accepted epidemic illness as an inevitable part of warfare. Some evidence suggests that experienced commanders tried to implement better hygiene practices, regular latrine relocation, designated water sources for drinking versus washing, keeping the camp clean. But theory and practice are very different things when you're managing thousands of men with limited resources and no understanding of germ theory. The commanders might know that dirty camps lead to sick soldiers, but they don't know why, which makes it hard to implement truly effective solutions. The latrine trenches represent a genuine health crisis. Every moment you spend near them, you're being exposed to pathogens that will eventually find their way into your system. E. coli, dysentery, cholera, typhoid. The trenches are a breeding ground for every waterborne and fecal-oral disease that plagued medieval populations. The flies that swarm around the waist don't stay at the latrines. They fly throughout the camp, landing on food, landing on faces, transferring microscopic amounts of fecal matter everywhere they go. You can't see the contamination happening, which makes it all the more insidious. The proximity of the latrines to the water source is a particular problem. The trenches are supposed to be far from the stream, but far in a crowded siege camp means maybe 100 yards, and the soil drainage means that waste is seeping into the groundwater that feeds the stream. Downstream soldiers are basically drinking diluted sewage. The boiling helps, maybe kills some of the pathogens, but not all of them. It's a slow-motion poisoning of the entire army. Nighttime latrine visits are especially terrible. You wake up in the darkness with urgent intestinal distress, probably from the questionable dinner, and face a choice. Try to make it to the latrines in pitch darkness, or find somewhere closer to relieve yourself and risk punishment if caught. The latrines at night are genuinely dangerous. You can't see the poles clearly. You can't see the edge of the trench. Men have fallen in during night visits, their screams waking the camp, and rescue operations in darkness from a latrine pit are exactly as horrific as you're imagining. Some soldiers choose the find somewhere closer option despite the risks. You discover unauthorized waste deposits all over the camp, behind tents, near the treeline, in corners where people think they won't be noticed. This spreads the contamination even further. You're walking through a camp where the ground is randomly contaminated with human waste, where you might step in something terrible at any moment, where disease vectors are literally everywhere. Your boots are probably contaminated. Your clothes are probably contaminated. You are definitely contaminated. The camp has rules about sanitation. Technically, soldiers are supposed to use only the designated latrines. They're supposed to keep their living areas clean. They're supposed to dispose of waste properly. Enforcement of these rules is minimal at best. The sergeants have bigger problems than sanitation compliance, and most soldiers are too exhausted and demoralized to care. The gap between what should happen and what actually happens is vast enough to drive a wagon through, and that gap is filled with disease. Women in the camp there are always camp followers. Washerwomen, merchants' wives, prostitutes face an even worse situation. The latrines offer zero privacy, and medieval society has different standards for women regarding bodily functions. Some women try to use the latrines during off hours when fewer men are around. Others create their own private arrangements, which usually means finding a spot behind a tent with a bucket. The bucket gets emptied where? Probably into the nearest ditch or trench. Nothing about this situation is good. You develop a routine over the following days. timing your latrine visits for periods when the facilities are less crowded. Though less crowded is relative, there's never a time when the latrines are actually pleasant or peaceful. You learn which poles are sturdiest, which positions over the trench minimize splashback riskies. Splashback is a concern. I'm sorry to put that image in your head, but this is reality, and which times of day the smell is least overwhelming. Least overwhelming still means catastrophically terrible, but you take what you can get. The intestinal issues that you were worried about start manifesting around week 3. It begins with stomach cramps that come and go, sharp pains that double you over at inconvenient moments. Then comes the diarrhea, sudden and urgent, sending you rushing to the latrines multiple times a day. You're not alone. Dysentery is sweeping through the camp like wildfire, as it does in every prolonged siege. The latrines become even more crowded as more soldiers fall ill, turning the facilities into an even more nightmarish place where sick men compete for pole positions while their bodies rebel against the toxic conditions they're living in. The diarrhea is weakening you. You're losing fluids faster than you can replace them, even drinking as much of the boiled water tea as you can stomach. Your lips crack. Your skin feels dry. Your eyes sink a little deeper into your skull. This is dehydration and malnutrition combining to create a perfect storm of bodily breakdown. You're not dying, not yet, but you're certainly not thriving. Nobody in this camp is thriving except the rats and the flies, both of which are having the time of their lives. One morning you witness something that will haunt you forever. A soldier, weakened by disease and malnutrition, loses his balance on the latrine pole. He falls sideways, not directly into the trench but close enough that his arm plunges into the waist. He scrambles out, screaming, covered in filth. Other soldiers rush to help, pulling him away from the edge, but the damage is done. His arm is coated in sewage, and there's no good way to clean it. They take him to the stream, scrub him with water and sand, but everyone knows he's infected now. Whatever diseases are breeding in that trench have direct access to his bloodstream through any tiny cut or scratch on his arm. He's dead. Effectively, just hasn't finished dying yet. He's gone within a week, fever taking him in delirium. The psychological impact of the latrine situation compounds all the other miseries of siege life. You're already cold, hungry, exhausted, and scared. Now add in the constant gastrointestinal distress, the humiliation of having no privacy for basic bodily functions, the fear of falling into the pit, and the certain knowledge that you're being exposed to deadly diseases every time you answer nature's call. It's dehumanizing in ways that are hard to articulate. You're reduced to your most basic biological functions, performed in the most degrading conditions possible, and there's no escape. The veteran in your shelter stops making trips to the latrines. He's too weak to walk that far, and his dignity has eroded to the point where he just relieves himself near the shelter, sometimes not even making it outside. The smell in your sleeping area worsens. Nobody has the energy or cruelty to call him out on a Turi, all dying here at different speeds, and his speed is faster than most. He's incontinent now, a symptom of the disease ravaging his system, and it's just one more thing to endure in a situation that's already unendurable. You develop a fear of the latrines that borders on phobic. Each visit is an ordeal, a test of courage as much as a biological necessity. You find yourself holding it longer than is healthy, trying to minimize trips, which only makes the situation worse when you finally have to go. The psychological stress of the latrines adds to your overall decline. One more weight on a psyche that's already buckling under the load. The flies are everywhere now, not just at the latrines. They've colonized the entire camp, attracted by the waste, the rotting food, the unwashed bodies. They land on your food while you eat. They crawl across your face while you sleep. They're in your shelter, in your clothes, in your hair. Each fly is a tiny disease vector, carrying microscopic amounts of sewage on its feet and body, spreading contamination with every landing. You can't escape them. You learn to eat quickly, waving away flies with one hand while shoveling food into your mouth with the other, accepting that you're probably consuming fly-contaminated food but having no alternative. The camp commanders occasionally make efforts to improve the sanitation situation. New latrines get dug when the old ones fill completely. Orders come down about keeping areas clean, disposing of waste properly, boiling all drinking water. But implementation is inconsistent, and the fundamental problem too, many people in too small a space for too long remains unsolved. You can't fix a structural problem with individual actions, and siege camps are structurally designed to be disease incubators. By your 4th week, using the latrines is such routine horror that you barely think about it anymore. You've adapted, which is not the same as things getting better, but rather you've adjusted your baseline for what constitutes normal. Squatting over a pit of biological nightmare while flies swarm around you and disease seeps into every pore? That's just Tuesday now. Your standards have eroded so completely that didn't fall into the shit trench today counts as a good day. This is what siege warfare does to the human spirit. It recalibrates your definition of acceptable until the unacceptable becomes mundane. And yet, somehow, this isn't even the worst part of your day. The latrines are terrible, yes, but they're predictable terrible. You know what you're getting. The real nightmare begins when your work assignment for the day gets announced, because that's when you discover that medieval siege warfare has found even more creative ways to kill you. The horn sounds at dawn, dragging you from the half-sleep that passes for rest in this place. Your body aches in ways you didn't know were possible. Your back is a solid mass of pain. Your hands are covered in blisters that have blistered, and your muscles feel like they've been tenderized with a mallet. You stumble out of your shelter into the gray morning light, and your stomach immediately sinks because you know what's coming: work detail assignments. And in a medieval siege camp, every job is designed to kill you, just with varying levels of creativity and speed. The sergeant is already at the assembly point, that same angry man with the missing ear who seems to take personal pleasure in assigning the worst tasks to the most exhausted soldiers. You line up with hundreds of others, all of you looking like extras from a zombie movie, hollow-eyed, filthy, swaying slightly from exhaustion and malnutrition. The sergeant consults a piece of parchment, though you suspect he can't actually read it and is just using it as a prop to seem official. You, and you, he barks, pointing at a group that includes Gaptooth from your shelter. Undermining crew. Report to the engineer. Gaptooth goes pale. Actually pale despite the dirt covering his face, because undermining is one of the most dangerous jobs in siege warfare. It involves digging tunnels under the castle walls to collapse them, and it has a mortality rate that makes regular combat look safe by comparison. Gaptooth shuffles off with his doomed crew, and you silently thank whatever gods might be listening that you weren't chosen for that particular death sentence. You lot. The sergeant continues, gesturing at another group. Siege tower construction. West side. That's not great either, hauling massive timbers, assembling structures while under arrow fire, working at heights with medieval safety standards, which is to say no safety standards whatsoever. Those men trudge off, shoulders already slumped under the weight of their assignment. Your turn comes. You. The sergeant counts off, his finger landing on you and 5 others, including the loud northerner. Trench filling and approach building. North approach. You close your eyes briefly. Trench filling means hauling baskets of dirt to fill in the defensive ditches around the castle, creating approaches for siege equipment. It means working in the open, fully exposed to whatever the defenders want to throw at you: arrows, rocks, boiling liquids, occasionally dead animals for psychological warfare. It's backbreaking labor with a significant chance of sudden violent death. Perfect. You collect your Tulsa wicker basket for carrying dirt, and a shovel that's seen better centuries. The basket has gaps in the weaving where dirt will leak through, making your job even more inefficient. The shovel's handle is cracked and wrapped with cord to hold it together. These are the tools you're expected to use to literally fill in defensive fortifications while people try to kill you. Medieval military logistics at its finest. Your crew makes its way to the north approach, which is currently a killing field. The castle sits on elevated ground, surrounded by a dry moat, basically a deep ditch designed to prevent siege equipment from reaching the walls. Your job is to fill in sections of this moat with dirt, creating ramps that siege towers and battering rams can use. Simple in concept, suicidal in execution. The approach is already littered with evidence of previous attempts. Broken baskets, abandoned tools, and dark stains on the ground that you really hope are mud but probably aren't. Arrow shafts stick out of the earth at odd angles like terrible flowers. The castle walls loom above, and you can see figures moving on the battlements. Defenders, people whose entire job today is to stop you from doing your job, preferably by killing you. An engineer man who apparently has some technical knowledge about siege warfare briefs your crew. Fill your baskets from the spoil pile. He gestures to a mound of excavated dirt about 50 yards back from the danger zone. Carry them to the moat edge. Dump them in. Repeat until the moat is filled or you're dead. Try not to die, replacements are running low. That's his actual safety briefing. Try not to die. You're starting to understand why medieval siege warfare had such spectacular casualty rates. You start the process. Load your basket with dirt, hefting it onto your shoulder. The basket is heavy, maybe 40 or 50 pounds of earth, and your malnutrition-weakened body protests immediately. You carry it toward the moat, walking across open ground, acutely aware that you're well within arrow range. Your shoulder blades itch with anticipation of an arrow impact. Every step feels like it might be your last. The distance to the moat edge is maybe 100 yards, but it feels like miles. Halfway there, you hear a sound like angry wasps. Arrows, multiple arrows, shot from the castle walls, arcing through the air toward your crew. Scatter! Someone yells, but you're carrying 50 pounds of dirt and can't exactly dodge gracefully. You drop flat, basket spilling, as arrows thud into the ground around you. One arrow lands so close to your head that you can smell the wood. It's fletched with gray goose feathers, and you notice absurdly specific details about it because your brain is trying to process the fact that you almost just died. The arrow barrage stops. The defenders are reloading. You have maybe 30 seconds. You scramble up, leaving your spilled basket, and run back toward the relative safety of the spoil pile. Your heart is hammering so hard you think it might rupture. Your hands are shaking. You're pretty sure you've pissed yourself a little. And honestly, that's probably a normal physiological response to nearly being killed. Welcome to your job. One member of your crew wasn't as lucky. He's on the ground, an arrow through his thigh, screaming impressively. Two soldiers run out, grab him by the arms, and drag him back to the medical area, leaving a trail of blood across the dirt. That's one down from your crew within the first 10 minutes of work. The mortality statistics for siege laborers are starting to make terrible sense. You reload your basket with dirt, hands still trembling. The loud northerner is next to you, also reloading, muttering prayers or curses or probably both. "This is fucking insane," he says, which might be the most accurate tactical assessment of the day. But the engineer is watching, and sergeants are scattered around to prevent desertion, so you heft your basket again and start the walk toward the moat. Again. This time you make it closer before the arrows come. You're 30 yards from the moat edge when you hear that wasp sound again. You don't drop flat this time, you're too close to the goal. You run, hunched over, basket bouncing on your shoulder, dirt spilling out the gaps in the weaving. Arrows hit the ground around you with meaty thunk sounds. You reach the moat edge, dump your basket, and run back without waiting to see the results. Speed is survival. The work continues for hours. Load basket, carry basket, dump basket, run back, repeat. The defenders shoot at you every few trips, sometimes missing, sometimes getting close enough to make you question every life choice that led to this moment. You develop a rhythm, a desperate efficiency born from terror. You learn to read the castle battlements, to anticipate when arrows are coming based on movement and shadows. It's not much, but it's something, and something is better than nothing when nothing means death. Historians still argue whether the commanders who assigned soldiers to these suicidal tasks understood the casualty rates or simply didn't care. The prevailing theory is that medieval warfare operated on an acceptable loss principle. Yes, you'll lose a certain percentage of workers, but as long as some survive to complete the task, the overall strategy succeeds. You're not a person in this calculation. You're a statistical unit. Some units will be subtracted through death or injury, but there are always more units available. This horrifying mathematics, but it's the logic that makes siege warfare possible. Around midday you think, time is strange when you're expecting to die any second something new happens. The defenders run out of arrows, or get bored, or decide to try a different tactic. You're carrying a basket toward the moat when you hear a different sound. A heavy whooshing, then a tremendous crash near the moat edge. You look up and see that they've dropped a large rock from the walls. Not thrown, just dropped, letting gravity do the work. The rock may be 200 pounds of stone, has cratered the ground exactly where you were standing 30 seconds ago. If your timing had been slightly different, you'd be a smear. Rocks are followed by other creative projectiles. At one point they drop what appears to be a dead dog, which is more psychological warfare than practical defense, but still deeply unsettling. They pour something hot, might be water, might be oil, might be something worse, down on workers who get too close to the walls. One man gets splashed and his screams suggest it's more than just hot water. Possibly lime, which was sometimes used in siege defense. Burning skin on contact. He's dragged away, and you don't see him again. Your basket is falling apart. The wicker is splitting from the repeated stress of being filled and dumped. You're not the only one with failing equipment. The whole operation is held together with determination and desperation rather than adequate resources. When your basket finally disintegrates completely, spilling dirt everywhere, you have to go back to supply and beg for a replacement. The supply master, a man who seems to consider every request a personal insult, eventually tosses you another basket that's even worse than your first one. You take it without complaint because complaining would waste energy you need for not dying. The moat is filling. Slowly. You can see progress, which would be encouraging if the cost wasn't measured in blood and screaming. By afternoon, your crew of 6 is down to 4. One took an arrow to the thigh early on. Another took an arrow to the chest around noon and died almost instantly, his surprised expression frozen on his face as he crumpled. The 2 survivors plus the loud northerner and yourself continue the work because stopping means punishment and continuing means maybe surviving the day. Maybe. Your body is breaking down in real time. Your shoulders are raw from the basket straps. Your hands are bleeding from blisters that popped and kept working. Your back feels like someone's driving hot nails into your spine. Your legs tremble with exhaustion. You're dehydrated despite drinking whenever water is brought around, sweating out more fluids than you're taking in. And you're one of the lucky ones. You haven't been hit yet, haven't been seriously injured, are still functional enough to work. The bar for lucky is underground. Late afternoon brings a shift change, sort of. Fresh workers arrive to take over, and your surviving crew is released to return to camp. You stumble back, legs barely functioning, and collapse near your shelter. You're too tired to eat when food comes around. too tired to do anything except lie there and stare at nothing. The loud northerner made it through the day too, and he's lying nearby in similar condition. Tomorrow, he croaks. Might be worse. He's probably right. The next day, you're assigned to a different nightmare, hauling siege equipment. Specifically, helping to move a massive battering ram into position. The ram is essentially a huge tree trunk, stripped of branches, capped with iron, and mounted on a wheeled frame with a roof to protect the operators. It's also monumentally heavy, requiring dozens of men to push and pull it into position. Your job is to be one of those men. The ram is positioned about a quarter-mile from the castle, where it was constructed. It needs to move closer, to a point where it can actually reach the gate. Moving it means rolling it across uneven ground, up slight inclines, through the partially filled moat approaches, all while defenders try to destroy it and everyone pushing it. It's like moving a house. If houses could get you killed and also you're already exhausted and starving. 40 men are assigned to the ram. You take positions along the sides and back, gripping whatever part of the frame you can reach. An engineer shouts, "Push!" and you push. The ram doesn't move. He shouts again, "Push! You worthless dogs!" You push harder. The ram creaks, groans, and finally rolls forward one grudging foot. This is going to take all day. Minimum. The work is crushing. You're putting your entire body weight into moving this massive object. Your feet slipping in mud. Your muscles screaming. Every few minutes you gain another yard. Maybe 2 if the ground cooperates. The defenders are shooting arrows at the ram, trying to hit the men pushing it. The ram's roof protects workers at the front, but you're on the side, partially exposed. Arrows zip past. One hits the man next to you in the shoulder, and he falls away screaming. The rest of you keep pushing because stopping means the ram rolls backward and crushes whoever's behind it. Hours pass in a blur of pain and effort. Push, rest, push, rest. Drink water when someone brings it. Push. Ignore the arrows. Push. Watch another man get hit and fall. Push. The ram inches forward, yard by agonizing yard, while the castle defenders do everything they can to stop it. At one point, they drop a massive boulder from the walls that smashes into the ground near the ram, missing by yards but sending a clear message. We see you, we're trying to kill you, and we might succeed. By the time you finally get the ram into its assault position near the gate, the sun is setting and you've aged a decade. Your entire body is a single unified region of pain. You can't tell where one ache ends and another begins. It's all just pain. Universal and overwhelming. You've watched 3 men die today and maybe a dozen more get seriously injured. The ram is in position, ready to start battering the gate tomorrow, and all you can think is that you'll probably be assigned to operate it, which means standing inside while defenders pour boiling oil through the murder holes above the gate. Can't wait. Other work details are equally horrific in their own special ways. You hear stories from other soldiers during the evening meal. The undermining crew including Gaptoothus digging tunnels under the castle walls, working in cramped dark spaces where cave-ins are common and suffocation is a real risk. They're literally tunneling like moles, shoring up the tunnel with wooden supports, hoping the tunnel reaches the wall foundation before the defenders realize what's happening and counter-tunnel to either collapse your tunnel or break through and murder you underground. Gaptooth looks even more haunted than usual, dirt permanently embedded in every pore, and won't talk about what it's like down there. That's never a good sign. The siege tower construction crews are building massive wooden towers that will eventually be rolled up to the castle walls, allowing soldiers to storm the battlements from above. This carpentry work, which sounds safe until you remember it's being done within arrow range, at dangerous heights, with green wood and inadequate tools. Men fall from the tower scaffolding regularly. You hear the screams. Sometimes, When someone loses their grip or a platform gives way. They're building monuments to desperation, and some of them are bleeding into the foundations. The supply chain workers have it marginally better, hauling food, water, and materials from the rear supply trains to the front lines. Still backbreaking labor, carrying heavy loads for miles, but at least they're not being actively shot at most of the time. Most of the time, because occasionally defenders send out raiding parties at night to attack supply lines, setting fires, stealing resources, and killing anyone they catch. Nowhere is truly safe. Some work details are randomly deadly in ways you can't predict. You hear about a crew assigned to build earthen ramps for approaching the walls. They're digging and moving dirt when they uncover a hornet's nest. In enclosed armor, which some workers wear for protection from arrows. Hornet stings are particularly dangerous because you can't remove the armor quickly. 3 men are stung to death before they can get their gear off. That's not enemy action, that's just the universe finding new ways to kill you. The truly worst assignments are saved for troublemakers or the desperately unlucky. Sapper work, which involves approaching the castle walls with axes and picks to try to damage the foundation stones, all while defenders pour literally everything they have onto you from above. It's a suicide mission with a less than 10% survival rate. You see the sapper crews assembling sometimes. Men with the look of the already dead, walking toward the walls with tools that feel like carrying your own gravestone. By your 6th week, you've rotated through most of the major work details. Some days you're hauling dirt. Other days you're moving equipment. One particularly terrible day you're assigned to ladder crew, which involves carrying huge siege ladders toward the walls during an assault attempt. The assault fails. Most don't. You watch men climb the ladders only to be pushed back by defenders, falling 20 feet to break on the ground. You're lucky. You were only carrying the ladder, not climbing it. Your definition of lucky has become very flexible. The psychological toll of the work is almost worse than the physical toll. Every morning you wake up knowing that today might be the day you die doing something pointless. Not dying in glorious combat, dying while carrying dirt, or pushing a ram, or falling off a construction project. There's no honor here, no glory, just random death distributed among the workforce. You start calculating odds compulsively. If your crew is 40 men and 3 die today, that's a 7.5% mortality rate. If you work 20 days at that rate, your chances of dying are. You can't do the math, but it feels high, very high. Sleep becomes difficult even though you're exhausted. You lie in your shelter replaying near misses, thinking about the arrow that landed inches from your head, the rock that would have crushed you if you'd been slower, the moment the basket strap broke and nearly sent you tumbling into the moat. Your mind is trying to process trauma but has no framework for it. So instead you just replay the moments endlessly, each replay wearing a groove deeper into your psyche. The loud northerner stops talking about his wife. He stops talking much at all, actually, which is alarming because talking was his whole personality. He works in silence now, moves in silence, eats in silence. Something broke in him during a particularly bad day on tower construction. You weren't there, but you heard he watched a friend fall and he hasn't recovered. Maybe he won't. The siege is breaking people faster than it's breaking castle walls. Your hands have transformed from the soft hands of a farmer into something resembling clawed tools. Calluses on calluses, blisters that turn to scar tissue, permanent dirt embedded under nails, fingers that don't fully straighten anymore from gripping tools for hours daily. These are siege hands now, and they'll never be normal again even if you survive. Your body is a record of this experience, writing permanent scars into muscle and bone. And tomorrow, you'll do it all again. The horn will sound. The sergeant will assign details. You'll pick up your tools and walk toward death, hoping it misses you one more time. This is your life now, not living, but not dying, which is the closest thing to success that siege warfare offers. After another soul-crushing day of nearly dying while moving dirt, you return to camp to discover that tonight there's entertainment. The word sounds absurd in this context. What could possibly count as entertainment in a place where the baseline experience is misery? But soldiers need something to break the monotony. Some distraction from the grinding knowledge that tomorrow will be exactly as terrible as today. So the camp has developed its own twisted version of leisure activities. And you're about to discover that medieval siege camp fun is roughly as enjoyable as everything else here, which is to say not at all. The evening meal has been distributed, your usual portion of questionable stew and hard bread, and instead of everyone retreating to their shelters to collapse, there's unusual activity near the central fires. Soldiers are gathering, forming a rough circle, and there's an energy in the air that's different from the normal exhausted resignation. Something is happening. You drift over with the loud northerner, who's shown a flicker of interest for the first time in days, drawn by the basic human need for something, anything, that isn't work or sleep. The crowd parts slightly and you see the attraction. Two soldiers are about to fight. Not training, not sparring, actually fight, bare knuckle, for the entertainment of everyone watching and, more importantly, for the gambling opportunities. One fighter is a massive man, easily 6.5 feet tall with shoulders like an ox and fists like hammocks full of rocks. His opponent is smaller but wiry, with the look of someone who survives through speed and meanness rather than strength. They're both stripped to the waist despite the evening chill, their ribs visible through skin because everyone here is losing weight, circling each other while the crowd shouts encouragement and insults in equal measure. Money is changing hands rapidly as soldiers place bets. Not actual money, for most few common soldiers have coins, but bets in the form of rations, spare clothes, tools, anything of value. You watch a man bet his only blanket on the big fighter, which seems insane until you realize that gambling is sometimes the only way to potentially improve your situation. If he wins, he gets 2 blankets. If he loses, well, he was probably going to freeze to death eventually anyway. This is siege camp logic. Desperate gambles are rational when your baseline is slow death. The fight begins with the big man rushing forward, trying to use his size advantage immediately. The smaller fighter dodges. Not quite fast enough, the big man's fist catches him on the shoulder, spinning him. The crowd roars. The small fighter recovers, darts in, and lands 3 quick punches to the big man's ribs before dancing away. They're both breathing hard already because malnutrition and disease have left everyone with minimal stamina. This won't be a long fight. Nobody here has the energy for a long fight. They trade blows for maybe 2 minutes, which feels longer when you're watching men genuinely try to hurt each other for fun. The big man lands a solid hit to the small fighter's face, and blood explodes from his nose in a spray that looks black in the firelight. The small fighter staggers but stays up, and the crowd appreciates his toughness with cheers. He retaliates with a low punch to the big man's stomach that doubles him over, then follows with an uppercut that snaps the big man's head back. It's brutal, primitive, and the crowd loves it because it's something to feel besides hunger and fear. The fight ends when the big man catches the small fighter with a haymaker that sends him sprawling into the dirt, unconscious before he hits the ground. The big man raises his arms in victory, blood streaming from his mouth, lost at least 1 tooth during the exchange, and the crowd erupts. Winners collect their bets. Losers curse their luck. The unconscious fighter gets dragged to the side and left to wake up on his own or not. Nobody's particularly concerned. That was tonight's entertainment. Watching 2 starving men beat each other senseless for the amusement of other starving men. Welcome to siege camp morale activities. Gambling permeates every aspect of camp life. Soldiers bet on everything because gambling offers the illusion of control, the fantasy that you can change your circumstances through luck rather than just enduring whatever fate assigns. Dice games run constantly near the fires. The dice are crude things, carved from wood or bone. The pips marked with a knife. weighted unevenly so that every game is slightly rigged, though nobody's sure in whose favor. Men huddle around these games, betting rations they can't afford to lose, driven by the desperate hope that tonight their luck will change. You watch a particularly intense dice game unfold near your shelter. 5 men sit in a circle, a wooden bowl serving as their dice cup. The stakes start: smell a piece of bread, a sip of wine from someone's carefully hoarded flask, but escalate quickly as winners get confident and losers try to recoup their losses. One soldier, a gap-toothed man who isn't gap-toothed from your shelter but could be his brother, is on a losing streak. He's already bet and lost his dinner, his spare shirt, and a knife he probably stole from someone else. Now he's betting his boots. Are you insane? Someone asks. Not unkindly. Boots are survival. Lose your boots and you're walking barefoot through a camp that's basically an open sewer, through mud and waste and who knows what else. Foot infections are common and often fatal. A small cut that gets contaminated can lead to gangrene, amputation, death. Betting your boots is betting your life. I'll win it back, the man says with the confidence of someone deep in gambling addiction. He doesn't win it back. He rolls, loses, and sits there staring at his now bare feet with an expression of dawning horror as he realizes what he's done. The winner takes the boots theory, too small for him, but he can trade the man. The game continues. The barefoot man staggers away into the darkness, and you wonder if he'll survive the week. Probably not. Card games are less common than dice because cards are expensive and fragile, but some soldiers have crude dection drawn on scraps of parchment or leather, the suits barely recognizable, but functional enough for gambling purposes. The games are variations of things you vaguely recognize, though the rules seem to change based on who's winning and whether they have a knife to enforce their interpretation. Arguments break out regularly, sometimes escalating to violence. More entertainment for the crowd. Historians still argue whether military commanders encouraged gambling as a morale tool or tried to suppress it due to the disorder it caused. Evidence suggests both happened. Some commanders banned gambling outright with harsh punishments, while others tolerated or even facilitated it, recognizing that soldiers needed some outlet for their desperation. Your camp falls into the latter category. The officers know gambling is happening, occasionally walk past the games, and do nothing. They have bigger problems. Beyond gambling, there are other forms of entertainment, though entertainment remains a generous term. Storytelling happens around the fire, soldiers sharing tales from home, embellishing their past exploits, inventing elaborate fictions about what they'll do when the siege ends. The stories are always better than reality, full of heroic deeds and happy endings, providing brief escape from the present nightmare. The best storytellers draw crowds, their audiences desperate for any narrative that isn't "we're all slowly dying in mud." One storyteller, an older soldier with a gift for dramatic delivery, tells a tale about a knight who single-handedly defeated a dragon and won a princess's hand in marriage. This complete fantasy bears no resemblance to anyone's real life, and the crowd is rivaled. For 15 minutes, nobody's thinking about hunger or fear or the castle walls that refuse to fall. The storyteller concludes his tale to applause, and for his efforts receives contributions from the audiencia. A bit of bread here, a sip of ale there, payment in the only currency anyone has. Music is rare but treasured. A few soldiers have instruments of battered lute, a simple wooden flute, a drum that's just a barrel with leather stretched over it. When they play, soldiers gather to listen, sometimes to sing along. The songs are universally depressing, as medieval music tends to be, full of death and loss and longing for home. There's one song that's particularly popular, something about a soldier who dies far from home and his ghost walks back to see his family one last time. Everyone knows the words. Everyone sings, voices cracking with emotion and malnutrition, and it's the saddest thing you've ever heard. You learn the popular songs by osmosis, hearing them night after night around the fires. There are bawdy songs about sex and drinking, though singing about pleasures you can't access feels more cruel than entertaining. There are work songs, rhythmic chants that would normally accompany labor, but here serve as nostalgic reminders of life before the siege. And there are songs about the siege itself, dark humor set to music, lyrics about starving and dying and hating the castle that won't surrender. Gallows humor is a major food group in this camp. The same 3 songs play constantly because those are the only ones everyone knows. You hear them so many times that they burrow into your brain, becoming the unwanted soundtrack to your existence. You'll be digging trenches and find yourself humming about the ghost soldier. You'll be trying to sleep and hear someone singing the Bawdy Tavern song for the 1000th time. Music was supposed to be uplifting, but here it's just another form of torture through repetition. Some entertainment is darker, more disturbing. Public punishments draw crowds because spectacle is spectacle, even when it's horrific. You witness a flogging one evening, a soldier caught stealing from the supply wagons, sentenced to 20 lashes. They tie him to a post, strip his back, and a sergeant with a whip delivers the punishment while soldiers watch. Some watch out of obligation, some out of morbid curiosity, some because it's something different from the routine. The man's screams echo through the camp, and after it's over, he's cut down and left to recover or not on his own. The next day he's expected to return to work detail with his back shredded. He doesn't make it through the day, infection sets in fast, and he's dead within a week. Executions are rarer but draw even larger crowds. Deserters, when caught, are hanged as examples. The whole camp is required to watch, a reminder of what happens if you try to escape your circumstances. You watch a hanging during your 3rd week. A young soldier, couldn't have been more than 17, caught trying to slip away in the night. They put the noose around his neck and he's crying, begging, saying he just wanted to see his mother. Nobody intervenes. The cart pulls away. He drops. And it's not a clean death because medieval hanging is more strangulation than neck breaking. He kicks and twitches for a long time before going still. That's your entertainment tonight. Watching a terrified kid die slowly while everyone's forced to observe. The psychological impact of these spectacles is complex. On one hand, they're supposed to deter bad behavior and steal. Don't desert, or this happens to you. On the other hand, they're dehumanizing and traumatic, adding another layer of horror to an already horrible situation. You go back to your shelter after the hanging and can't sleep, replaying the image of the boy's face turning purple, his legs kicking at nothing. The loud northerner vomits, not from illness but from disgust or horror, or maybe just the accumulation of too much awfulness. There are quieter, less organized forms of entertainment. Men carve things from wood-crude figurines, dice, pieces for board games using knives and patience they somehow still possess. The carving serves multiple purposes. It creates objects of value for trading, fills empty hours, and it gives hands something to do besides shake from fear or hunger. You see elaborate carvings sometimes, surprising artistry emerging from this terrible place. Soldiers revealing talents they never had reason to display before. Board games materialize, scratched into dirt or drawn on cloth. Simple strategy games, variations of chess or checkers, games you don't recognize but can learn the rules for through watching. They're cognitive exercise in a place where your brain is mostly occupied with survival calculations, offering brief opportunities to think about something abstract rather than immediate and threatening. You try playing once, struggle to concentrate through the hunger and exhaustion, lose badly, and don't try again. Prostitution exists in the camp, part of the camp follower ecosystem. Some women are here willingly, conducting business transactions, trading sex for money or food or protection. Others are here less willingly, circumstances or coercion having left them with limited options. The transactions happen in tents, behind shelters, in dark corners, brief encounters that serve biological needs and offer momentary escape from reality. You don't participate, you're too exhausted, too malnourished, and the whole thing feels depressing rather than appealing. Some soldiers visit the prostitutes regularly, spending rations they need to survive for 15 minutes of distraction. Desperation takes many forms. Alcohol is theoretically available but practically rare. The camp receives occasional shipments of weak beer or wine, distributed in tiny portions that barely qualify as drinks. When alcohol does arrive, it disappears immediately, either drunk or traded at premium rates. You taste beer exactly once during your time here. Someone shares a sip from their cup, and it's sour and warm and wonderful because it's different from water. You don't get drunk because there's nowhere near enough alcohol for that, but the mere taste of it is escapism, a reminder that other experiences exist beyond suffering. Some soldiers have maintained practices from home, small rituals that offer psychological anchoring. Evening prayers for those religious enough to still believe in divine mercy despite overwhelming evidence against it. One man performs elaborate grooming routines every evening, carefully washing his face with hoarded water and combing his hair with a bone comb, maintaining dignity through personal care even as everything else deteriorates. Another soldier draws pictures on scraps of material crude sketches of his family, his home, his farm, carrying his past with him in ink and memory. The camp develops its own social hierarchies and groupings based on shared misery. Soldiers from the same region cluster together, speaking in dialects, sharing memories of home. Work crews bond through shared trauma. You develop a strange kinship with the men you nearly died beside, hauling dirt or pushing siege engines, even if you don't particularly like them as people. Your shelter group is a forced family of sorts, bound by proximity and interdependence, navigating conflicts and cooperation in tight quarters. Arguments are constant entertainment, really soldiers fighting over imagined slights, disputed possessions, or just general irritability from living in terrible conditions. Most arguments fizzle out quickly because nobody has the energy for sustained conflict, though occasionally they escalate to violence. You witness a stabbing one evening, two men fighting over who owned a particular cup, one pulling a knife and putting it in the other's gut before anyone can intervene. The stabber is arrested, the stabbed man dies overnight, and tomorrow both their possessions will be redistributed to other soldiers. Life and death and property are all fluid here. Rumors are entertainment in themselves, wild speculation about when the siege will end, stories about what's happening in other parts of the war, fantasies about rescue or reinforcement or the enemy surrendering any day now. None of it is true, or if it is, it's distorted beyond recognition through multiple retellings. But it gives people something to discuss besides their immediate misery. You hear that reinforcements are coming next week. You hear that the king is negotiating a truce. You hear that another castle fell to siege in just 3 days using a new secret weapon. None of it happens. The siege continues unchanged. By your 7th week, you've settled into the grim rhythms of camp entertainment. You know when the gambling games start. Know which storyteller is performing which night. Know the words to the 3 songs everyone sings. It's not enjoyable. Nothing here is enjoyable, but it's routine. And routine is how you survive. Small pockets of not work, not sleep, filled with activities that distract from the reality that you're slowly dying in a field of mud while a castle refuses to surrender. And speaking of dying, let's talk about the real entertainment in this camp. Disease. Because while you've been gambling and singing and watching men beat each other for fun, something invisible has been working through the camp. Something far more deadly than enemy arrows. Something that's about to make your already nightmarish existence exponentially worse. You wake up one morning and immediately know something is wrong. Not wrong with you, wrong with the camp. There's a sound you haven't heard before. Silence. Not peaceful silence, but the eerie quiet of collective dread. The usual morning noises, coughing, talking, the clatter of soldiers preparing for work detail are muted, replaced by something heavier in the air. You crawl out of your shelter and notice clusters of soldiers huddled together, speaking in low voices. The word spreads quickly, whispered from group to group like a prayer or a curse. Plague. Not metaphorical plague. Not the general awfulness of siege camp life, but actual disease, the kind that sweeps through crowded, unsanitary conditions and kills with horrifying efficiency. Someone died last night, you learn, and not from wounds or starvation but from fever. He'd been fine yesterday morning, worked his detail, ate his evening meal. By midnight he was burning up, delirious, covered in sweat. By dawn he was dead. And he's not the only one. 3 other soldiers are showing symptoms. High fever, severe headaches, body aches that make movement agony. The disease has arrived, and it's hunting. The veteran in your shelter, who's been deteriorating for weeks with his persistent cough, takes a turn for the worse. His cough becomes wet and rattling, punctuated by gasps for air. His face is flushed with fever, his eyes glassy and unfocused. He's shaking despite being wrapped in every blanket the shelter group could spare, which isn't many. You touch his Fordata mistake. Really, because now you've potentially contaminated your hand and it's scorching hot. His skin dry and papery. He's dying, clearly dying, and there's absolutely nothing anyone can do about it. Medieval siege camp medicine is, to be extremely generous, rudimentary. The camp has a medical area, which is really just a corner of the camp where sick and wounded soldiers are deposited, tended by a handful of individuals with varying levels of medical knowledge. There's a barber surgeon, a man whose primary qualifications are that he owns sharp implements and doesn't faint at the sight of blood. He handles wounds, amputations, and the occasional tooth extraction. For actual diseases, he's as helpless as everyone else, working with a medical understanding that predates germ theory by several centuries. You help carry the veteran to the medical area, his body burning against yours, his breath coming in short, painful gasps. The medical tent really just an open-sided canopius already crowded with the sick and dying. Soldiers lie on the ground in various states of distress. Some are unconscious, some delirious, some just staring at nothing with the look of people who've accepted their fate. The smell is indescribable. Disease sweat, vomit, excrement from soldiers who've lost control of their bodily functions, and underlying it all, the sweet sick smell of death. The barber surgeon examines the veteran with the efficiency of someone who's seen this many times before. He checks the fever, looks at the tongue, feels for swollen lymph nodes. Might be camp fever, he announces, which is medieval medical speak for, I have no idea but it's killing him. Camp fever is a catch-all term for any of several diseases that ravage military populations. Typhus, typhoid, dysentery in its advanced stages, or any number of other infectious diseases that thrive in conditions of crowding, poor sanitation, and compromised immune systems. What can you do? You ask, knowing the answer but needing to hear it anyway. Bleed him, the surgeon says matter-of-factly. Balance his humors. Maybe leeches. Prayer wouldn't hurt. This is medieval medicine, removing blood from a patient who's already dying from disease, based on the theory that illness results from imbalanced bodily fluids. It doesn't work, it's never worked. It's actually counterproductive, but it's the standard treatment because nobody knows any better. The veteran is too weak to protest as the surgeon opens a vein in his arm and lets blood drip into a bowl. You watch, feeling helpless and angry, as medical intervention actively worsens your sheltermate's condition. You leave the veteran there because you have work detail. Disease doesn't excuse you from labor, and spend the day hauling dirt while trying not to think about what's happening back in camp. When you return that evening, The veteran is dead. His body has been dragged outside the medical tent, joining a row of other corpses awaiting burial. His face is peaceful at least. The suffering finally ended. You feel nothing, which bothers you. Shouldn't you feel something? He was your shelter mate for weeks. But you're too tired, too emotionally depleted, too focused on your own survival to properly grieve a man you barely knew. The disease spreads. By the end of the week, dozens are sick. By the end of the second week, the death toll is climbing daily. The camp's burial detail soldiers assigned to dig graves and dispose of bodies can barely keep up. They dig mass graves, long trenches into which bodies are dumped without ceremony, covered with dirt, and forgotten. There's no time or energy for individual burials, no priests to perform last rites, no markers to identify who's buried where. You die, you get thrown in a hole, and the siege continues without you. Historians still argue whether military commanders understood that disease killed more soldiers than combat in medieval warfare, or if they genuinely believed combat was the primary danger. Statistical analysis of historical sieges suggests that disease casualties typically outnumbered battle casualties by ratios of 3-to-1 or higher. Your siege is following this pattern perfectly. The castle defenders have killed maybe 100 soldiers over 2 months through arrows, rocks, and other defensive measures. Disease has killed 3 times that in 3 weeks and is accelerating. The symptoms vary depending on what specific disease is spreading, and there's probably multiple diseases working through the camp simultaneously, each finding their own victims. Typhus, spread by body lice, which everyone in camp has in abundance, causes high fever, severe headaches, and a characteristic rash. Typhoid, spread through contaminated water, which you're all drinking, causes sustained fever, abdominal pain, and the kind of diarrhea that dehydrates you to death. Dysentery, also waterborne, turns your intestines into weapons against yourself, causing bloody diarrhea and cramping so severe some men die from the pain alone. You start checking yourself obsessively for symptoms. Every morning you assess. Fever? Headache? Unusual fatigue? But you're always tired, often have headaches from dehydration and stress, and your body temperature is hard to assess when you're chronically cold and occasionally shivering from exposure. You're in a constant state of low-level panic, waiting for the disease to claim you, knowing it's not a question of if but when. The camp attempts quarantine measures, sort of. Sick soldiers are supposed to stay in the medical area, away from the healthy population. But healthy is relativivrions compromised in some way, and enforcement is impossible when soldiers are living shoulder to shoulder in shared shelters. The sick sleep next to the healthy because there's nowhere else to put them. The disease passes through breath, through touch, through the contaminated environment that everyone shares. Quarantine would require space and resources the camp doesn't have. Some soldiers take desperate preventive measures based on medieval medical beliefs. You see men wearing pouches of herbs around their neck, supposedly protective herbs like rue or wormwood, which do nothing but smell bad. Some deliberately avoid bathing, believing that water opens the pores and lets disease in, which is darkly funny because nobody's bathing anyway. Others try bloodletting on themselves, preemptively balancing their humors, weakening their bodies right when they need strength most. Superstition and ignorance are killing people as surely as the diseases. The loud northerner develops a cough, and your stomach drops. It starts as nothing much, just a small throat clearing, the kind everyone does constantly from breathing smoke and dust. But it worsens over days, becoming deeper, more persistent, producing phlegm that's increasingly discolored. He develops a fever, not high but present, enough to make his eyes too bright and his skin clammy. He keeps working because stopping means certain death from punishment or starvation, but he's moving slower, struggling more, and everyone in your shelter knows he's infected. You should probably distance yourself from him. You should probably move to a different shelter. Find less contaminated sleeping arrangements. But where? Everyone's infected or exposed or about to be. There's no safe space in this camp. And besides, you've developed something like friendship with the northerner. If friendship can exist in conditions this extreme, you can't just abandon him, even though staying might kill you too. Medieval siege camps don't offer good choices, only varying degrees of terrible ones. The medical tent expands as more soldiers fall ill. They erect additional canopies, requisition more blankets, assign more burial details. The barber surgeon is overwhelmed, working 20-hour days, covered in the sweat and blood of the dying. He's probably infected himself impossible not to be, given his constant exposure, but he keeps working because what else can he do? Sometimes duty is just continuing to function while everything falls apart around you. You see treatments that range from useless to actively harmful. Leeches applied to fevered bodies, because removing blood definitely helps when you're already weak. Poultices of bizarre ingredients, moldy bread, animal dung, crushed herbs applied to skin in the hope of drawing out disease humors. Prayers and blessings from the camp priest, a haggard man who's losing his voice from constant last rites. Nothing works. The disease takes who it wants, and medieval medicine can only witness the dying. Gaptooth from your shelter gets sick next. His symptoms appear overnight. Crushing headache, fever so high he's hallucinating, seeing things that aren't there. He talks to his mother, who's been dead for years, having full conversations with empty air. He screams about demons at the tent entrance. He weeps like a child. Disease strips away adult dignity, reducing grown men to confused, terrified children. You help restrain him when his thrashing threatens to hurt himself, holding down his burning, sweat-soaked body while he fights against enemies only he can see. The food supply becomes contaminated as sick soldiers continue working in food preparation because there's nobody to replace them. The cooks are coughing into the cauldrons, hands unwashed after using the latrines or tending the sick. The water supply, already questionable, becomes a disease vector as soldiers too sick to walk to the latrines relieve themselves closer to camp, the waste seeping into groundwater. The camp is creating a perfect cycle. Contaminated environment causes disease. Disease prevents proper hygiene. Poor hygiene worsens the environment. It's a death spiral with no bottom. Some soldiers respond to the plague with fatalism that borders on suicide. If they're going to die anyway, why not die quickly? You see men volunteer for the most dangerous assignment, sapper work. First wave assault attempts. Anything with high mortality rates because a quick death from an arrow seems preferable to slow death from disease. The commanders are happy to use them. Suicidal soldiers make excellent shock troops. The castle defenders must be confused by the sudden increase in aggressive assaults. They don't realize they're fighting men who've already given up on survival. Others respond with religious fervor. Prayer circles form nightly, soldiers begging for divine intervention, promising reformed lives if only God spares them. The camp priest is everywhere, offering comfort and last rites, his own face growing gaunt as the stress and exposure take their toll. Some soldiers flagellate themselves, believing disease is punishment for sin, hoping self-inflicted suffering will satisfy divine wrath. It's medieval Christianity in crisis mode, desperate bargaining with an apparently indifferent deity. You develop your own coping mechanisms. You wash your hands in boiled water whenever possible, not because you understand germ theory, but because cleanliness feels protective somehow. You avoid touching your face, though that's nearly impossible when flies land on you constantly. You try to eat and drink only from your personal bowl and cup, not sharing utensils. These measures probably help marginally, more luck than effective prevention, but they give you the illusion of control in a situation where you're fundamentally powerless. The disease reaches the command tents. Even the nobility aren't immune, despite their better living conditions. A night dies, then another. The commanders start looking worried, finally understanding that this isn't just a peasant problem. Death is equalizing, coming for everyone regardless of rank. Rumor spreads that the siege might be lifted early, that the army can't sustain these losses, but nothing changes. The siege continues because abandoning it would mean all these deaths were for nothing, and commanders can't accept that level of meaninglessness. Gaptooth dies on a Tuesday. You think, though days blur together. One morning he's burning with fever, raving about devils. By evening he's gone, his body added to the pile awaiting burial. The loud northerner's condition worsens daily. His cough produces blood now, bright red spots on the rag he uses to cover his mouth. He's lost frightening amounts of weight, his face skeletal, his eyes sunken so deep they look like holes. He knows he's dying. Everyone knows. He stops talking about surviving, stops making plans for after the siege. He exists in the present, breath by painful breath. You're still healthy, somehow. Not healthy. Nobody here is healthy, but not actively dying of disease. Just slowly dying of everything else. You've made it through the first month of the plague, which improves your odds slightly. Those who survive the initial wave are either lucky, slightly more resistant, or just haven't been exposed to the right combination of pathogens yet. You'll take any of those options. The camp population is visibly declining. Work details are smaller because there are fewer soldiers available. The camp feels less crowded, which would be positive except you're walking past mass graves every day. Constant reminders of why the population is dropping. The commanders start pulling soldiers from the rear areas, bringing up reserves to replace the dead and dying. Fresh troops arrive, looking relatively healthy and clean, and you know they'll be dead within a month. The camp is a meat grinder, and the supply of meat is endless. One night, unable to sleep from the chorus of coughing around you, you crawl out of your shelter and just walk through the camp. It's eerily quiet for a place housing thousands. The fires burn low. Figures huddle around them, men too sick or scared to sleep. The medical tent glows with lamplight, silhouettes moving with insurgents and attendants working through another night. You walk to the edge of camp and look at the castle, still standing, still defended, utterly indifferent to the death happening on all sides of it. The siege has become a stalemate of suffering. The castle won't fall, but neither side can walk away. You're trapped in a slow apocalypse of your own making. The loud northerner dies during your 9th week, coughing blood until he drowns in it, his eyes terrified at the end. You're with him, holding his hand, feeling his pulse flutter and stop. He was annoying in life, talking constantly about his wife, his home, his life before this. Now he's quiet forever, another body for the mass grave. You help carry him to the burial pit. There's no one else to do it and watch as he's dropped in with 24 others. No ceremony, no words, just bodies in a hole. That night, you develop a cough. Just a small one. Probably nothing. Probably just smoke irritation. But your hand trembles as you touch your forehead, checking for fever, and you realize with perfect clarity that you're not going to make it. The disease has finally found you, and medieval medicine has nothing to offer except leeches and prayer. Time to discover if the real horror of siege camp life is the dying, or the waiting to die. The siege has been going on for 3 months now, and you're starting to understand that time itself becomes a weapon in this kind of warfare. Not the dramatic, exciting weapon of swords and arrows, but a slow, grinding weapon that wears away everything: morale, health, sanity, hope. You've survived disease so far. That cough you developed turned out to be nothing serious. Just another false alarm in a camp full of them, but survival doesn't mean winning. It just means you're still here, still trapped, still waiting for something to change while nothing changes at all. The castle sits on its hill exactly as it did 3 months ago. The walls are still intact, the defenders still visible on the battlements, the gates still closed. Your army has filled in sections of the moat, positioned siege equipment, launched assaults that failed spectacularly, and sacrificed hundreds of soldiers to wounds and thousands to disease. And for all that effort, for all that death, the strategic situation is essentially unchanged. The castle hasn't fallen. The defenders haven't surrendered. You're no closer to victory than the day you arrived. That realization sits in your stomach like a stone. This might never end. The psychological toll of prolonged siege warfare is something nobody prepared you for. In your old life, that half-remembered existence before the siege time meant something. Seasons changed, crops grew, festivals marked the year's progression. Time was purposeful, leading somewhere. Here, time is circular, each day identical to the last. You wake up in your damp shelter. You choke down inadequate breakfast. You work brutal details that accomplish nothing visible. You eat inadequate dinner. You try to sleep despite the cold and wet and fear. Then you wake up and do it all again. And again. And again. Forever. Apparently, the boredom is crushing, which sounds absurd when you're also in constant danger and discomfort. But humans aren't built for sustained crisis without resolution. Your body and mind stay in a constant state of stress adrenaline that never fully subsides, vigilance that never rests, fear that becomes ambient rather than acute. You're exhausted but can't relax, terrified but can't flee, suffering but can't imagine relief. It's psychological torture, unintentional but effective, grinding away your mental health as surely as the conditions grind away your physical health. You start having what you'll later recognize as dissociative episodes, though you don't have words for it now. Moments where you're working hauling dirt, pushing siege equipment, whatever today's futile task isn't, suddenly you're not really present. You're watching yourself from outside, seeing your body go through motions while your consciousness floats somewhere else. It's disturbing and also a relief, a mental escape valve when the pressure becomes too much. You come back to yourself minutes or sometimes hours later, with no memory of the interval, your body having continued working on autopilot. The loud northerner is dead. Gaptooth is dead. The veteran is dead. The young kid who deserted is gone. The mute one died 2 weeks ago from an infected wound. You're the last survivor of your original shelter group, now sharing space with replacement's new soldiers who arrived from the rear, still relatively fresh, not yet completely broken by the siege. They have energy you've forgotten how to access, optimism that seems alien and slightly offensive. Give them a month. They'll be as hollowed out as you are. Desertion attempts increase as the siege drags on. Soldiers slip away in the night with growing frequency, willing to risk execution rather than endure another day of this. The commanders respond with harsher punishments: public hangings, floggings that leave men crippled, threats of decimation, though nobody's quite desperate enough to actually implement that yet. Decimation, the Roman practice of executing every 10th man in a unit as punishment for cowardice or mass desertion. The threats increase fear but also resentment. You're not fighting for glory anymore. You're staying because leaving means death. But staying also means death. Just slower. Some soldiers go mad. Genuinely mad. Their minds breaking under the sustained stress. You see men talking to themselves, responding to voices nobody else hears, acting on delusions that make sense only to them. One soldier becomes convinced he's already dead, that this is hell, and nothing anyone says can convince him otherwise. Technically, he's not wrong, this is hellish, but his breakdown is complete. He stops eating, stops working, just sits and stares at nothing until he dies from self-neglect. The camp has no mental health resources, no understanding of psychological trauma. Madness is treated as moral failing or demonic possession, not as injury requiring care. Your own mental state is deteriorating. You can feel it. Thoughts come slower. Focusing requires enormous effort. Your memory is unreliable. You forget conversations you had hours ago. Lose track of what day it is. Sometimes can't remember if something happened yesterday or last week. Malnutrition affects the brain as much as the body, and you're running on years' worth of caloric deficit compressed into months. Your brain is eating itself, essentially breaking down its own tissue to keep essential functions running. The commanders keep promising the siege will end soon. Just a few more weeks, they say, exactly as they've been saying for months. The defenders are running out of food. Reinforcements are coming. A new strategy will break the stalemate. None of it materializes. The promises are lies or delusions. Strategies to maintain morale that stopped working months ago. Nobody believes the commanders anymore. You go through the motions of military discipline because punishment for disobedience is immediate while the promised rewards remain forever theoretical. Historians still argue whether medieval commanders genuinely believed their optimistic timelines or knowingly lied to maintain control. Evidence suggests both. Some commanders were self-deluded, convinced by their own plans despite reality, while others cynically manipulated their troops with false hope. Your commanders probably fall somewhere between hoping they're right while suspecting they're not, issuing confident predictions to mask their own uncertainty. Leadership in siege warfare requires either tremendous conviction or tremendous dishonesty, often both. The castle defenders occasionally communicate with the besieging army, shouting messages from the walls or sending out heralds under flags of truce. The messages are always some variation of, "We can hold out longer than you can." And they might be right. Castles under siege have advantages: walls for protection, presumably stockpiled supplies, the psychological security of being inside fortifications. The attackers have numbers but also vulnerability, exposed to weather, dependent on supply lines, subject to disease in a way that castle garrisons usually aren't, at least not initially. You wonder sometimes about the people inside the castle. Are they suffering as much as you are? Do they have enough food? Are diseases spreading inside the walls? You'll never know. They're abstracted, reduced to the enemy, though you have no personal quarrel with them. They're defending their home or their lord's property. You're attacking because you were ordered to. Nobody out here chose this conflict. It was chosen for you by people sitting comfortably somewhere else, making strategic decisions that cost them nothing. Some soldiers develop elaborate fantasies about what they'll do when the siege ends. They plan in minute detail the route home, the reunion with family, the first proper meal, the woman they'll marry, the farm they'll buy. These fantasies become more important than reality. Mental refuges where the future is guaranteed and happy. You listen to these plans and say nothing, because what would you say? That you've stopped believing in after? That you can only conceive of the present, endless and unchanging? That hope is a luxury you've lost? Your own fantasy, when you allow yourself to have one, is simple warmth, not family, not home, not food or comfort, just being warm. Actually, fully warm, for the first time in months. No damp clothes, no cold ground, no wind cutting through inadequate shelters. Just warmth, steady and reliable. It's such a modest dream that it makes you want to cry, except you've forgotten how. Crying requires emotional energy and tears require water, and you have neither to spare. The siege equipment that took weeks of brutal labor to construct sits mostly unused. The battering ram made a few attempts on the gate, accomplished nothing before defenders disabled it with dropped rocks and burning oil. The siege towers were rolled within arrow range and promptly set on fire by defenders using flaming arrows and projectiles. Months of work, hundreds of deaths during construction, and it all amounted to nothing. The castle stands untouched, mocking your efforts. The commanders start discussing other strategies. Negotiation, perhaps offering terms for surrender that wouldn't completely humiliate the defenders. Except neither side wants to negotiate because that would mean admitting the siege was a waste. Or escalation, bringing in more troops, more equipment, trying to overwhelm through sheer numbers. Except the supply lines are already strained and more troops just means more disease vectors. Or abandonment, lifting the siege, marching away, accepting defeat. Except the political cost of abandonment is too high. So the siege continues, not because anyone thinks it will succeed, but because nobody can figure out how to stop. Supply shipments become less frequent. The army's logistics are breaking down as the siege stretches beyond all reasonable planning. Food quality, already terrible, worsens. Quantities shrink. Some days rations don't arrive at all, and you just go hungry, your body burning whatever remaining reserves it can find. You're down to maybe 3/4 of your original body weight, probably less. Your ribs are visible. Your face is gaunt. Your arms are stick-thin. You look like a medieval painting of famine personified. The changing seasons make everything worse. You arrived in late summer when it was at least warm. Fall brought rain that turned the camp into a swamp. Now winter is approaching. You can feel it in the air. That particular cold that promises snow and ice and conditions that will kill even more soldiers than disease already has. Nobody's prepared for winter siege warfare. The shelters that barely sufficed in autumn will be death traps in winter. You don't have adequate clothing, adequate blankets, adequate anything. Winter is coming, and it's going to murder everyone. Some soldiers start deliberately seeking death, not through suicide exactly, but through recklessness that amounts to the same thing. They volunteer for every dangerous assignment. They take unnecessary risks during work details. They walk toward enemy fire without dodging. It's suicide by siege, choosing active death over passive dying. The commanders don't stop them. Suicidal soldiers are useful for desperate assaults, and nobody else has the energy to intervene. Everyone's too busy managing their own survival to worry about others' deaths. You have a moment of clarity one evening, sitting by a dying fire, too tired to sleep. You realize you've completely forgotten what you're fighting for. Not forgotten in the sense of momentary confusion, but genuinely cannot remember the cause, the reason, the objective that justified any of this. The castle belongs to some lord who offended some other lord, or there's a succession dispute, or it's strategic territory in a larger war. Honestly, you were never clear on the details, and now they seem completely irrelevant. The war has become self-justifying. You fight because you're fighting. You suffer because you're suffering. You continue because stopping would mean it was all meaningless. The camp starts showing signs of organizational collapse. Work details are poorly coordinated or skip days entirely. Food distribution becomes chaotic, with some soldiers getting double rations while others get nothing. Discipline erodes as sergeants die or stop caring. Theft increases because enforcement decreases. The camp is degrading from military organization towards something more primitive, more desperate. Every man for himself. It's not there yet, but you can see the trajectory. A rumor circulates that the King Hoover's king is supposedly backing this siegeus, considering pulling the army out. The rumor spreads with desperate hope. Maybe this ends. Maybe you go home. Maybe survival is possible. But days pass, weeks pass, and nothing changes. The rumor was probably false, or the decision was reversed, or it never existed except as collective wishful thinking. The siege continues. It always continues. You start marking time not by days but by deaths. The Gaptooth who wasn't your Gaptooth died 3 deaths ago. That supply wagon arrived 5 deaths ago. Your last decent meal was maybe 15 deaths ago. It's morbid but somehow more accurate than tracking days, which blur together into an undifferentiated gray mass. Death is the only reliable marker of time's passage. The only thing that definitely happened that you can point to and say, that was then, this is now. The psychological warfare is almost worse than the physical. The defenders occasionally taunt you from the walls, shouting about how comfortable they are, how well-fed, how your army will die of old age before the castle falls. It's probably propaganda theory, likely suffering too, but it gets in your head. You imagine warm rooms, full bellies, dry clothes, everything you don't have. The mental torture of imagining comfort while experiencing misery is exquisite, a special kind of torment that arrows can't deliver. Some night you stop caring whether you live or die. Not in a suicidal way, just a fundamental exhaustion with the project of survival. It takes so much energy to stay alive, finding food, staying clean enough to avoid deadly infection, avoiding the 1,000 ways to die in siege camp, and for what? To wake up tomorrow and do it again? Where's the end point, the reward, the justification? You keep functioning because your body has momentum, but your will is gone. You're alive by inertia rather than intention. The first snow falls during your 14th week. It's beautiful for about 10 seconds, white flakes drifting down, covering the mud in pristine white, and then it's just another layer of cold and wet. Snow melts into your shelter, soaks your already damp blanket, makes the ground even harder and colder. Soldiers without adequate clothing start showing signs of frostbite, blackened fingers and toes, the tissue dying from cold. The medical tent fills with frostbite cases, and the barber surgeon starts performing amputations, removing dead fingers and toes to prevent gangrene. Winter has arrived, the killing season, and you're barely holding on as it is. You realize one night, shivering in your shelter, that you probably won't survive winter. Probably nobody will. The siege will end not because either side wins, but because everyone dies, besiegers from exposure and disease, defenders from starvation, mutual extinction through stubbornness. It's absurd, darkly funny in a way that doesn't inspire laughter. All this suffering, all these deaths, and the final outcome is nothing. Nobody wins. Nobody achieves objectives. Everyone just dies in muddy fields or behind stone walls, and eventually, the war moves somewhere else to kill different people. But morning comes anyway, because it always does, and the horn sounds for work detail, and you drag your frozen, exhausted body out of the shelter because what else can you do? The siege continues. It always continues. That's the real horror of siege warfare, not the spectacular violence or the dramatic assaults, but the grinding continuation, day after day, week after week, month after month, until you can't remember life before the siege and can't imagine life after it. You exist in an eternal present of suffering, and that's your life now. That's everyone's life. The siege is reality, and reality is the siege, and nothing else exists or ever will. You've been here for 4 months now, which feels simultaneously like forever and like no time at all. The siege camp has become your entire universe. You can barely remember what your village looked like, can't quite picture your family's faces anymore, have lost the details of who you were before this. The person who arrived here months ago is dead, effectively replaced by this hollow thing that looks like you but operates on pure survival instinct. And now, finally, you're beginning to understand the real mathematics of siege warfare, the brutal calculus that nobody explained when this started. Almost nobody survives unscathed. The statistics are grim, though nobody's keeping official records. Of the roughly 10,000 soldiers who began this siege, maybe 6,000 remain alive. Disease killed at least 3,000: typhus, dysentery, camp fever, and half a dozen other illnesses you can't name but recognize by their symptoms. Combat killed perhaps 500 through enemy action during assaults, work details, and random defensive fire, accidents, exposure, starvation, and other causes claimed the rest. That's a 40% casualty rate. And the siege hasn't ended. The numbers will only get worse. But crude death tolls don't capture the real damage. Of the 6,000 survivors, how many are actually functional? You look around the camp and see walking wounded everywhere. Soldiers with amputated fingers or toes from frostbite, men with persistent coughs that suggest lung damage, others with wounds that healed badly leaving them partially disabled, and everyone with the hollow-eyed look of psychological trauma. Maybe half the survivors could be considered combat effective, and even that's generous. The siege has destroyed this army not through spectacular battles but through attrition, grinding men down until they're shells of what they were. You're one of the survivors, technically, but survival is relative. You've lost probably 30 pounds, maybe more. Hard to tell when you don't have a scale and your clothes hang loose on a frame that's been stripped of everything non-essential. Your teeth are loose from scurvy, bleeding gums that make eating painful even when there's food worth eating. Your hands are permanently damaged, scarred and calloused and missing feeling in several fingers from repeated injuries and frostbite. Your lungs rattle when you breathe deeply, damage from months of smoke inhalation and probably a respiratory infection you fought through without realizing how much it would cost you. The psychological scars are harder to quantify but more profound. You startle at sudden noises, your body flooding with adrenaline at sounds that remind you of incoming arrows. You can't sleep properly even when exhausted. You wake repeatedly through the night, heart pounding, checking for threats that aren't there. Food anxiety is constant. Even when eating, you're thinking about the next meal, mentally calculating how long you can survive on current rations, hoarding scraps that you rationally know are too spoiled to eat but can't bring yourself to discard. These aren't quirks. They're symptoms of trauma that will follow you for whatever remains of your life. The camp has changed, degraded into something barely recognizable as military organization. The neat sections that different lords' forces originally claimed have dissolved into a chaotic sprawl. Shelters are erected wherever there's space, order replaced by organic growth driven by desperation. The latrines have multiplied and migrated, creating a landscape dotted with waste pits that everyone tries to avoid but nobody can entirely escape. The whole camp is a contaminated zone now, every surface touched by disease, every corner harboring dangers visible and invisible. Discipline has eroded to almost nothing. Work details still happen but with reduced coordination and enforcement. Sergeants who survived are either dead inside or too sick to care, going through motions without conviction. Some soldiers simply refuse assignments, and often nothing happens. There aren't enough healthy enforcers to punish every act of defiance. And the commanders have bigger problems. The army is held together by inertia and lack of alternatives rather than actual military structure. Historians still argue whether prolonged sieges were ever militarily worthwhile given the catastrophic casualty rates and resource expenditure. Analysis of medieval warfare suggests that sieges succeeded roughly 40% of the time. But success meant the castle eventually fell. It didn't account for the cost in lives, resources, and time. Your siege is shaping up to be a failure. 4 months in, massive casualties, and the castle is still standing. Even if it falls tomorrow, was it worth 4,000 deaths and 6,000 ruined lives? The strategic value of one castle seems wildly disproportionate to the cost of taking it. The defenders are suffering too. You've learned. Supply shortages, disease seeping through sieges work both ways, and the psychological toll of being trapped under constant threat. Occasionally you see bodies thrown from the castle walls, defenders who died from disease or starvation, their corpses disposed of the only way available. It's morbid confirmation that misery isn't exclusive to your side. Everyone in this siege is losing, just at different rates. Some soldiers who survive physically will never recover mentally. You know, a man survived disease, survived injuries, still functional enough to work, who's developed a facial tic, his eye twitching constantly, a visible manifestation of internal damage. Another survivor has become completely silent, hasn't spoken in weeks, just performs his duties like an automaton. The loud northerner's replacement in your shelter rocks back and forth when he sits, a self-soothing motion that suggests he's retreating into himself. These men might live for decades after the siege, but they'll never be whole again. The siege hollowed them out, and the hollowness is permanent. Your own future, assuming you have one, is almost impossible to imagine. If the siege ends and you're released to go home, what then? You're physically damaged, possibly permanently. Farm work. Your previous occupation requires strength and stamina you no longer possess. Your community might not recognize you, literally might not know who this skeletal, scarred stranger is. Your family, if they're still alive, if they survived whatever's been happening in the world while you've been here, will be meeting someone who looks like their son or brother but acts like a traumatized stranger. The war won't end when you leave the siege. It'll just continue inside your head. The economic impact on survivors is rarely discussed but significant. Many soldiers were conscripted, forced into service, and received minimal payment, if any. For months of no productive work, no income, while families presumably struggled without your labor. Even if you're owed back pay doubtful, medieval accounting being what it is, the amount won't compensate for lost time and destroyed health. You'll return to civilian life poorer than when you left, in every sense of the word. Some survivors won't return to civilian life at all. War has a way of trapping people. You see career soldiers in camp, men who've gone from siege to siege, campaign to campaign, unable or unwilling to leave military life. Sometimes it's because they have nothing to return to, families dead, homes destroyed, skills obsolete. Sometimes it's because civilian life no longer makes sense to them. The structure and purpose of military life, however grim, provides meaning that peaceful existence doesn't. They're institutionalized by warfare, and leaving would be more traumatic than staying. You wonder if you'll become one of them. The thought is horrifying and oddly comforting. Horrifying because it means accepting this nightmare as permanent. Comforting because it means not having to figure out how to be normal again. Not having to explain to civilians what you've experienced. Not having to bridge the unbridgeable gap between people who've lived through this and people who haven't. Maybe it's easier to just stay in the nightmare where at least everyone understands the rules. The castle still stands. After 4 months, thousands of deaths, endless suffering, the strategic situation is fundamentally unchanged. Recent assaults failed as spectacularly as earlier ones. The siege equipment is destroyed or abandoned. The moat remains partially filled but still effective. The defenders, though weakened, still control the walls. Military logic suggests abandoning the siege, cutting losses, accepting defeat. But military logic and military pride are different things, and pride keeps the siege going despite all evidence that it's unwinnable. A rumor circulates, more credible than previous rumors. The army will withdraw at winter's end. Too many dead, too few supplies, too little progress. The commanders are supposedly negotiating a face-saving agreement, not surrender, but tactical repositioning, or some euphemism that allows both sides to claim they didn't lose. You don't believe it until it happens, but the rumor persists, spreading through the camp, kindling hope in men who'd forgotten what hope feels like. Even if withdrawal happens, it's not salvation, it's just a different form of suffering. The march back to wherever home is will kill more soldiers. You'll be traveling in winter, through potentially hostile territory, with minimal supplies and maximum vulnerability. Stragglers will die of exposure. The sick will be abandoned when they can't keep pace. Bandits will prey on weakened soldiers. The journey might be as deadly as the siege itself, just faster and with different scenery. You think about the men who died here, thousands of them buried in mass graves that won't even have markers. Their families will never know exactly what happened, never visit graves, never have closure. They'll receive word eventually, if they receive word at all, that their son, husband, father died during military service. No details, no explanation, just the fact of death. Those men will be forgotten, their sacrifices meaningless, their suffering unrecorded. In a few generations, nobody will even remember this siege happened, let alone the names of who died in it. The math is brutal. 40% casualty rate so far, with deaths accelerating as winter and disease compound. Of survivors, maybe half will have permanent physical damage. Nearly all will have psychological trauma. Of those who make it home, some percentage will never reintegrate, becoming social outsiders, beggars, or career soldiers trapped in the cycle. If you do the full calculation, maybe 20% of the original force will survive relatively intact. And intact is generous, they'll all be scarred in ways visible and invisible. You're in the 20%. Maybe you're alive, functional enough to work, haven't lost any limbs or developed any obviously fatal conditions. But you're not the same person. You can feel the changes, the hardening of something that should have stayed soft, the death of parts of yourself that you didn't know could die. The siege killed you in ways that don't show up in casualty lists, replacing you with someone who can survive this but might not be able to survive peace. One evening, sitting by a fire that provides more smoke than warmth, surrounded by the hollow-eyed survivors of this catastrophe, you realize the siege has already achieved its purpose, just not the military one. It's proven that humans can endure almost anything, that the body and mind will cling to survival even when survival means prolonged agony, that there's no suffering so profound that some people won't continue through it. You're not proud of surviving. You're not grateful to be alive. You're just here, stubbornly persisting, because giving up requires energy you don't have. The stars are visible tonight, rare in the usually overcast sky. You stare up at them, those distant points of light that don't care about sieges or suffering or any human concerns. The universe is vast and indifferent, and your pain means nothing to it. That should be depressing, but instead it's oddly freeing. Nothing you do here matters in the cosmic sense. The siege will end or it won't. You'll survive or you won't. Either way, the stars will keep shining, time will keep moving, and the world will continue its indifferent rotation. Tomorrow you'll wake up and do it all again. Work detail, inadequate rations, cold and wet and fear. Or maybe tomorrow you'll die, an arrow through the chest or disease taking you in the night, or 1,000 other possibilities. Either way, you've already survived longer than most, endured more than you thought possible, proven that you're harder to kill than you would have believed 4 months ago. That's not triumph. Triumph would require winning something, but it's something. Survival isn't nothing, even if it isn't much. The horn will sound at dawn. The siege will continue. And you'll keep going because that's what you do now, what you've learned to do, what this place has taught you. Endure. Not live, not thrive, not even particularly hope, just endure. Breath by breath, day by day, until something changes or something ends. That's your achievement, if you can call it that. You became someone who could survive a medieval siege camp, and that transformation cost you everything you were before. The siege didn't make you stronger. It made you harder, colder, smaller, reduced to pure survival function. And somehow, impossibly, you're still here, still breathing, still enduring, still not quite dead yet. And so the siege continues into the winter, into the uncertainty, into whatever comes next. Some castles eventually fall. Some sieges are abandoned. Some armies withdraw in defeat while others claim hollow victories over ruins they destroyed to capture. Your fate, like that of every soldier here, rests on decisions made by distant commanders, strategic calculations that treat lives as numbers, political considerations that have nothing to do with the men dying in mud. But for now, in this moment, you're alive, damaged, traumatized, barely recognizable as the person you once were, but alive. The medieval siege camp promised you nothing except suffering, and on that promise at least, it delivered completely. You survived it, after a fashion, though survival might be too generous a word for what you've become. You persisted. You endured. You didn't die, which is the lowest possible bar for success, but apparently the only one that matters out here. The fire is dying down. The camp is settling into its uneasy night rhythms. Somewhere in the darkness, someone is coughing. Someone else is crying quietly. The castle walls loom against the stars, silent and unmoved by all the death at their base. And you sit here, one survivor among thousands of dead, wondering if making it this far was fortune or curse, unable to decide which you'd prefer it to be. The siege grinds on. You grind on with it. That's the truth of medieval siege warfare, not the glory or the strategy, but the grinding, the slow reduction of humans to their minimal functional components, the discovery of exactly how much suffering a person can endure before they break. You haven't broken yet. That's your victory, such as it is. Tomorrow might be different, but tonight, in this frozen muddy hell, you're still here, still breathing, still impossibly, stubbornly, pointlessly alive. The night deepens around you, soft and cold. The sounds of the camp fade into the background, a distant murmur like waves on a shore you can barely remember. Your body relaxes, finally, the constant tension easing just slightly. Tomorrow will bring what it brings, but right now, in this quiet moment, you can simply rest. Let the thoughts drift away. Let the worries settle. Let the darkness be gentle, wrapping around you like the blanket you wish you had, warm and soft and safe. Your breathing slows, deepens, matches the rhythm of sleep that's been waiting patiently for you. The siege continues somewhere far away, but you can rest now. Just rest. Close your eyes. Breathe slowly. Let it all go. Just for tonight. Just for now. Sleep comes softly, mercifully, carrying you away from the cold and the fear and the endless waiting. Sleep. Finally. Sleep.